How to Be Happy Giving Your Money Away by Dr. E.M. Clark. Chapter 1. Making the Right Decision. A young man in his late teens left Oklahoma and journeyed to California, the land of gold and sunshine, to seek his fortune. Once there, he prospered in everything he did and finally became a highly successful businessman. Some years later, his younger brother back home called and told him that their father had passed away. The California businessman replied that he was in the middle of the biggest business deal of his lifetime and couldn't possibly leave to attend the funeral. But he said, "You bury Dad in style and send me the bill. I will be glad to pay it." Sometime later, he got a bill for the funeral. It was far more than he expected, but since he had promised to pay it, he did. The next month, he got a bill for $48.50. He was surprised and wondered what it was for, but he paid it. The next month, he got another bill for $48.50. Finally, he called his brother and said, "I got the bill for the funeral. I hadn't realized that a funeral could cost so much, but since I couldn't be there, I was glad to pay it. But I have been getting billed for $48.50 a month. I am at a loss to know what in the world this is for." His brother explained, "Well, you said to bury Dad in style, so we rented a tuxedo." You see, it takes money to go, especially if you go in style. And the world is going in style today. Every business that is of any importance today has the most modern buildings, the latest equipment, the best personnel, and adequate room for parking. Larger and more luxurious shopping malls are replacing older ones that are outdated for the age in which we live. It's a fact. If you want to keep growing, you have to keep paying to keep up with the times. This is as true in the church world as it is in any other business. If the buildings aren't adequate, modern, and attractive with well-staffed, capable people, it goes the way of other businesses that do not keep up with the times. National polls tell us that after a church grows to 85% of its occupancy space, it is impossible to hold the growth at that level. It will surge up for a time and then stall like an overloaded airplane. Then the growth cycle has to be repeated again. One of the cardinal rules for church growth is adequate room. In a recent poll of 10,000 churches, 90% said they could not enlarge because of lack of finances. As a result, they had decided to limit their work in their community to the size of the facilities they were presently occupying. Taking the plunge. Making the decision to build is always difficult and demands serious scrutiny. Even Jesus said we should count the cost before we start to build. See Luke 14:28-30. On the other hand, sometimes we make the mistake of trying to solve all the problems before making a decision. This is difficult, if not impossible, to do. If you make the right decision, you can always solve the problems arising from having made that decision, no matter how many obstacles you face. There will always be a risk factor involved in any decision we make. I wish it wasn't that way, but it is. In fact, you will never know just what you can do until you face a situation where you just have to do it. This idea is illustrated by the story of an old Texas rancher who had a coming-out party for his 16-year-old daughter on her birthday. He had the biggest barbecue, the largest band, and the best entertainment, a party to end all coming-out parties. When everyone had been wined and dined and entertained to the very ultimate, he said, "Now I want to show you something you will never see on another ranch in Texas." He led the partygoers out back of the barns to a well-lighted area where there was a giant swimming pool full of alligators. He said, "For 7 years I have had a standing offer of $100,000 to anyone who can swim across that pool. It has never been claimed." Just then, there was a splash, and a young man started swimming frantically over one alligator and under another. With their huge jaws snapping all around him, he swam, miraculously escaping every one of them. As he finally reached the other side and pulled himself out of the pool, two big jaws just grazed his feet. The old Texas rancher was waiting there to help him out of the water. He was so excited. He said, "Man, I never saw such swimming in my entire life. You've earned the $100,000. You can have it in cash, in cattle, in stocks, in bonds, anything you want. You have earned it. Tell me, how do you want it?" The young man could hardly get his breath, but when he could, he ignored the rancher's question and asked, "All I want to know is, who pushed me in?" During my life, I have been pushed a few times and had to make the most of the situation. Most ventures in life are risky, however, and it is still best to get our orders directly from headquarters before taking the plunge. Before I get involved in any kind of ministry or fundraising effort, I make sure it is one to which God has called me. In fact, I have made it a rule never to go anywhere to serve the Lord or to raise money unless I am sure God has called me there. I do not believe God would call me somewhere to do a work for Him and then not help me to do what He had called me to do. Here are my rules for successful living. 1. Be sure God has called me. 2. Find out what He wants me to do in that place. And 3. Find out when He wants me to start. Once these 3 items are settled, I know if I carefully and prayerfully seek to follow God's leading, He will help me accomplish what He has called me to do. These 3 principles have kept me from making a lot of mistakes and from biting off more than I could chew. It's a good thing because everything God has called me to do has demanded that I raise money. I have always heard that success in life is largely made up of making right decisions. Looking back over my own life, I have had to make many major decisions. I know I would probably have made the wrong choice in many instances if God had not directed me. One situation in particular stands out in my mind. Decisions that changed my life. In 1933, I was spending the summer with C.E. Thurmond, who was the pastor of the church in Watertown, South Dakota. Although I had been a Christian for only 18 months, I had definitely felt the call of God to preach the gospel. During that summer, Pastor Thurmond and I traveled to Lake Geneva Camp in Minnesota and met A.A. Anderson there. This evangelist told us about a meeting he had conducted in Moran, Michigan, out of which a group of believers had come together. He needed someone to go there and build a work. Pastor Thurmond said to me, "You want to preach. Here's your chance. This is an opening. If you want to get into the ministry, go for it." At the time, I had been traveling with a musical group and teaching school. I didn't want to go. I knew very little about starting or pastoring a church. It was so far away. In fact, there was no Assembly of God church in that district within 200 miles. Without praying about it, I told the Lord I didn't have the money to make the trip. A check came in the mail. I still didn't ask God what He wanted me to do. I just decided not to go. The Lord spoke to me anyway. I had a dream in which God made it clear He wanted me in Moran. What else could I do? I packed my bags and went to Moran, Michigan. During the 2.5 years I pastored in Moran, I gained a knowledge of God's Word I had never known before and started a self-supporting church. It was the most valuable experience of my life up to that time, and the Lord taught me not to make hasty decisions about any opportunity presented to me. After I left Moran, I felt the Lord leading me to preach revival meetings. I decided that I would not ask for meetings, but wait for pastors to ask me. That method worked. In my 2.5 years as a traveling evangelist, I never lacked for invitations and always had meetings booked ahead. In spite of the lesson learned at Moran, I still almost missed the most important meeting of my life. A pastor by the name of Grayel of the Bible Standard Church at Dunning, Nebraska, asked me to come for a meeting. I was reluctant. It was a small town and a little church, and it was not of our denomination. Every roadblock I put in the way of my going there, God removed. I finally had to go. The first night of the meetings in Dunning, we started with a small crowd of about 6 people. Some of the church leaders had received a revelation that God was through with Dunning, and there would never be a revival there again. I found that hard to believe, and the next day I delivered flyers to every business place in town, even the bars. Then I went from door to door inviting the people of the town to our meetings. On the second Sunday night, the church was completely filled. People began finding God. Some had unusual visions. Many were filled with the Holy Spirit. Having outgrown the church, we moved the services to a large tent located midway from 5 towns. The tent revival continued for 13 weeks, and hundreds of people experienced the power of God manifested in ways I myself had never seen. People were saved, healed, and filled with the Holy Spirit. It was during those meetings that I met my life partner, Estella, the greatest earthly blessing that has ever come to me, and to think I almost missed her. Don't make hasty decisions. After we married and were settled for a time, Estella and I decided to leave Ord, Nebraska, where we had been pastoring, and go into evangelistic work. We already had about 18 months of meetings lined up. In the meantime, the district superintendent of our denomination had recommended us as pastors to the Assemblies of God Church at South Sioux City. When a lady from the church called and asked us to come and preach over a Sunday as candidates for the pastorate, I told her that we had previous engagements. We finally agreed on a date for 3 weeks later. When we arrived in South Sioux City late on a Saturday evening, the lady we were to contact told us, "Another man has recently been here to preach. He was out of a job, and most of the church people have already decided on him. But some people thought we should try out several pastors." I felt like turning right around and going back home. I hadn't asked for the church. They had asked for me. When we got to the deacon's house where we were to stay for the night, Estella and I were given a very cold reception. I did not sleep a wink and had to force myself to stay in that house until the next morning. I remembered what I learned at Moran, Michigan. Don't make hasty decisions. All night God kept reminding me, don't make hasty decisions. Stay and see what happens. With an open mind, I decided to make the best of a tense situation. To my amazement, when I walked into that church the next morning, I felt like I had been there all my life. I began my message by telling the congregation, "You don't know if you would want us as pastors. We don't know if we want you as a congregation. Let's forget about all that and just enjoy the day." Both the morning and evening services were filled with the joy and presence of the Holy Spirit. I couldn't remember when I had been in services more exciting. Estella and I were blessed to be a part of them. After the evening service, the church board asked, "If you are voted in, will you become our pastor?" I said, "After all that has happened here, I feel if the people want us, it would have to be God's will." The church voted the following Tuesday and later told us we received more votes than any pastor who had ever been there. Learning the ropes. During our 4 years of steady growth and revival at South Sioux City, God began to challenge me in a new and different way. We were able to get our radio program on the Yankton station. At that time, WNAX had the tallest antenna in North America, reaching out to 9 states and 3 provinces in Canada. Airtime was quite expensive. Our church, however, wasn't interested in sponsoring a program on the station, so our family underwrote it. The station trusted us implicitly as long as we paid cash in advance. One Sunday, I was depending on the morning offering to help us pay for that week's program. It was the policy in that church to pay the pastor's salary from the offerings received. The blessing of God moved in the service from the very beginning, and there was no appropriate time for an offering. I felt I could not interrupt what God was doing among the people. That night, the baccalaureate ceremony was being held at our local high school, so we had canceled the evening service. I wondered what I would do. I had always had the money for the station up to this time. Since there had been no Sunday offerings, I had received no money for the week. I went by the post office on my way home to find 2 letters in the mailbox. Usually an envelope might contain $1 or $2. I opened them there in the post office. One had a money order for $70. This would pay the radio bill. The other had a check for $10. I immediately thought of that old song, "God is still mindful of me each hour." That experience taught me about God and His faithfulness. I was beginning to learn to trust Him financially in a different way. During this time, the church in Scottsbluff, Nebraska asked me to come and try out for the pastorate. I was hesitant, but the district superintendent of our denomination urged me to consider their offer. He did give this word of caution, however. "It would be best for you to refrain from getting too interested in raising money to build a new church," he admonished. "Ministers in the past who have let this happen to them have regularly been voted out of the church." Our family traveled to Scottsbluff, where I was to preach on Sunday. When we arrived, I couldn't help but notice that the old church building was tied together with steel rods at the roof level. All through my sermon, I kept looking over my head, expecting the swaying roof to collapse with the slightest gust of wind. In spite of the fact that the restrooms were under the floor in a small space just big enough to contain them, the people seemed very satisfied with the building. It was evident they did not want anything changed. After I got back home, I phoned the church's search committee and told them we didn't feel led to accept the pastorate. I thought that would be the end of it, but the church got back in touch with us and wanted us to reconsider. I told them I would pray about it, and when I did, God let me know I was to go there, even though it was a smaller church, paid less salary, and the people didn't want to build. Rules that result in blessing. After 6 months of pastoring in Scottsbluff, I came to the conclusion that I was wasting my time, God's time, and the people's time. That church would never grow without new facilities. On the first Monday night in February 1946, I brought up the idea of a new building at the church board meeting. To say they were stunned would be an understatement. When they finally recovered from my suggestion, I still couldn't see a friendly face in the group. The meeting lasted until after midnight. Usually nothing good happens in a board meeting after midnight, but they finally agreed that if I could raise $3,000, they would bring it before the congregation for a vote. I felt an urge to say, "My wife and I will give $500, but I didn't. My first reaction was, surely that can't be God. He knows I only get about $27 a week. I couldn't even borrow that amount of money. But again, I felt the impression, only stronger this time. I knew it was God speaking to me, and I immediately spoke up and said, "My wife and I will give $500. When I simply said what God told me to say, the walls began to crumble and the victory started. At that time, I didn't know that I had just fulfilled two of the cardinal rules of fundraising, both of which required God's intervention in order to succeed. 1, I did what God impressed me to do. 2, I expressed it publicly. In a matter of 1 week, the people had pledged $3,000. Within 3 months, my wife and I were able to pay our pledge of $500, the highest pledge anyone made. I still don't know just how we did it. Somehow it seemed easy. Although all I had to go on was the voice of God, I have learned that He never asks us to do anything impossible. While at Scottsbluff, I had become a close friend to a local contractor who was a Christian. He told me he would oversee the building of the church and donate his time. He also offered to charge us only when his men worked. The men in the church volunteered their time, and I also worked steadily on the building. It was a great education. By the fall of 1946, we had a new brick church to dedicate. I have never forgotten the power that comes when one person obeys God and leads in giving. In this particular instance in Scottsbluff, a number of things happened as a result. 1, we had a beautiful new brick church, the first one in the valley after the war. 2, God sent a revival that more than doubled the church in less than a year after moving into it. 3, we had the largest Sunday school in the state in our denomination that year. 4, we had the first missionary convention in our denomination ever held in the state of Nebraska as far as I could learn. And 5, we paid off the church debt in 3 years. Obedience moved us to a new plateau spiritually, and we were never the same after that revival. Unusual healings were the order of the day, and our membership grew and grew. Whole families came into the church, received the baptism in the Holy Spirit, and most of them tithed. In fact, some of the men who were saved during that revival are prominent ministers today. God also blessed our family financially in a way He never had before. We were able to purchase our first new car and have been able to drive new cars ever since. Leaving in the black. After we had been at Scottsbluff for about 5 years, we got a letter from Wilford Brown, the general treasurer of our denomination, asking me to consider taking the job of director of the National Radio Department. I had no interest in a job like that. Besides, I didn't know enough about radio to oversee a work of that size, so I didn't even answer the letter. A year later, I saw Brother Brown, and he asked Estelle and me to have lunch with him. He talked with us at some length about the job and asked us to consider it. We decided to make a visit to Springfield to talk with our denominational executives. On the way home from that meeting, the Lord spoke to me so definitely that I knew this move was the will of God for us. In the next 7 years, I learned more than during any other 7 years of my life. With God's help, I had made the right decision. Diplomacy and compromise became a necessity as I learned how to work around the, quote, big wheels in our denomination. The general superintendent, 4 assistant general superintendents, plus a general treasurer and a general secretary, without getting my hands caught in the gears. I also lost my fear of other preachers. That happened when I learned that they are sympathetic to whomever is preaching. As a result, preaching to preachers became my first love. 2 years after I took the job, the radio department went from cutting records and sending them out to about 50 stations to a live program on the ABC network with C.M. Ward as full-time speaker. This was a life-changing experience for me and required the raising of extensive amounts of money on an ongoing basis. First of all, we needed money to pay a full-time speaker and the cost of airtime for nearly 400 stations. Fortunately, I had learned about direct mail from my experiences at WNAX, the station in Yankton, South Dakota. At revival time, I wrote all the promotional letters and built up the mailing list to 50,000, which became our best source of income. A development director was never hired, so I did the fundraising work as well, traveling all over the nation, preaching in churches, touring districts, preaching camp meetings, and promoting revival time. I discovered that if I gave first in the offering and told my audience what I had given, the offerings were always larger. In order to sustain a consistent income for the ministry, I talked with the pastors and board members of the churches I visited and encouraged them to become monthly supporters. As an incentive, we offered a revival time sign that could be placed in front of each church participating in regular giving to the radio work. When Estella and I left in 1958 to pastor Bethel Church in Quincy, Illinois, the radio department was running well in the black. I am sure God called us to the revival time ministry. He never calls us to fail, but to succeed in doing what He wants done. Chapter 2. Why Giving Makes Us Happy. Some years ago, I was called to the little town of Verdon, Illinois, to raise money for a church building. They had to move to a new location in order to expand and needed $50,000 to get started. The future growth of their church depended on the success of this venture. On Sunday morning, I spoke to the congregation about giving and had just started to take commitments when a young man stood up and asked to speak. He said, "My wife and I have been up most of the night praying, and God has definitely spoken to us about what we should do. We just sold our house," he continued, "and had $10,000 equity. We plan to buy another home and use the extra money as a down payment. God spoke to both of us and said, 'You can do better by giving the $10,000 to the church and renting for a while.'" The young man's offer was shocking, to say the least, but God had obviously dealt with this couple. I would never have suggested to anyone that they make such a bold offer. In fact, his decision appeared to be a very unwise thing to do. I also knew, however, that making a substantial gift of at least 10% of the total amount needed and doing it openly often ensures the success of a fundraising venture. Who was I to argue with God's methods? Some months later, I met the pastor of the Verdon Church at a national meeting and asked him what happened to that young deacon and his wife who gave their down payment on a house to the building program. Smiling, he answered, "Brother Clark, you'd never guess what happened. About a month after they had given their money to the church, another local couple had to vacate their house in order to relocate to take a better job. They had no time to put their house on the market, so they offered it to our deacon and his wife if they would just take over the mortgage payments with no money down." "That's wonderful," I replied, relieved to know God had blessed them. "But there's more," the pastor continued. The house was new, and the mortgage was less than our couple had planned to pay for an older home. They have moved in and are very happy. This couple did what looked like a foolish thing, but look at the end result. Blessing above anything they could ask or think. They have a better home than they could have bought, and Verdon has a new church. The happy, cheerful giver. Anyone who raises money must be a giver himself. He must also be convinced that it doesn't ever hurt anyone, including himself, to obey God in giving if he is sure of God's leading. Once that truth is settled in the leader's heart and mind, he will not have to bluster and threaten or tell people how much they should give. He will not have to oversell. The leader can relax and let God and the people work it out. The fundraiser's main job is to get God and the people together working on the problem. I have learned a lot from 2 Corinthians 9. In this chapter, the Apostle Paul is raising money for the famine sufferers in Judea, and all the churches under his care are being asked to make a special fund drive for this cause. In verse 7, Paul says, "Every man according as he purposeth in his heart, so let him give, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loveth a cheerful giver." Let's look at the 4 parts of this verse. 1. Every man according as he purposeth in his heart, so let him give. Let God deal with each man as to what amount he is to give. 2. Not grudgingly. This would suggest that the person has been crowded into giving and that his heart is not in it. 3. Or of necessity. This again indicates that the person is being pushed because of the urgency of the need. And 4. God loveth a cheerful giver. The word used here, cheerful, is translated from the word hilaros, which really means hilarious, or, as I like to think of it, happy, enthusiastic, and spontaneous. How can you be cheerful and give away your hard-earned money at the same time? This is a good question. The answer is in verse 6. But this I say, he which soweth sparingly shall reap also sparingly, and he which soweth bountifully shall reap also bountifully. Here Paul likens giving to God, or to the poor in this case, as sowing. We all know that the reaping is far greater than the sowing. Jesus spoke of the sower whose seed brought forth some 100, and some 60, and some 30-fold. See Matthew 13:23. This is about what a farmer would expect to reap, about 30 times more than the original amount of seed, or it could be 60 times what he sowed, or even 100 times as much when the crop is harvested. Paul says we will reap according to how much we sow. The entire chapter of 2 Corinthians 9 is filled with promises to the giver. There is not one threat. There is not one line to make people feel guilty. All I see here are promises of blessing. Those who give can feel happy because God's work is being done. At the same time, we can be assured that God will reward us for what we do for Him and His cause. Those in need also will rejoice because God's people have been generous in helping them. Paul compliments the people. He doesn't rail at them. The Apostle Paul teaches us several important principles in these verses. 1. Giving is learned. 2. People can only give happily according to their faith. 3. Good things happen to those who obey God in their giving. 4. Many times the givers become the key to victory in a situation, especially if they give openly. And 5, example is a tremendous force in anything we do for God. The giver is doing God's work, and God is rewarding him for it. Over the years, I have seen God do miracles for those who are happy givers. The spirit of giving. Some years ago, I was invited to be the morning and night speaker at a pastor's conference in West Texas. A prominent pastor of a Texas church was one of the day speakers, and he mentioned to me that he and his wife were getting ready to return to the mission field. "We've announced our decision, but have not resigned our pastorate as yet," he told me. "In the months to come, we will be raising our support to go overseas as missionaries." I held that thought in the back of my mind. That same day, the district youth leader asked me to go to lunch with him. "The youth department has gone into the red about $30,000, he said. "I wondered if you could give me some ideas to bring it in line." I didn't seem to be able to give him much help, but told him I would think about it. That night at the pastor's conference, I felt strongly led to speak on the topic of giving. As I was speaking, I felt a spirit of giving sweep over the audience. I knew the people were ready to give, but I was at a loss as to what to do. The district superintendent had not given me any permission to take an offering. If I did take an offering, I felt there were 2 needs to consider: the couple going to the mission field and the need in the youth department. While still in the pulpit, I prayed silently and could not get an answer as just what to do at the close of my message. So I finished and sat down. The district superintendent started singing a chorus. About halfway through the song, a young man started walking down the aisle and up to the platform. He whispered something to the superintendent and then went to the pulpit. As the young man started to speak, he was overcome with emotion and began to weep. When he could finally talk, he told of his deep burden for the youth department and the financial need. Then he said, "God has burdened me to give $1,000 toward this need." Immediately, a beautiful spirit of worship and a broken spirit swept the audience. Other people began to stand up and make commitments to the youth department. This kept up for perhaps 20 minutes. When they were through, the pastors had committed approximately $30,000. Nobody asked for money, but somebody had been praying, and God supplied the need. God didn't need my help, so he just didn't tell me anything. Thank God I didn't try to do something myself. I obeyed God by speaking on giving, and God took care of the rest. There is more to this story, however. When opportunity knocks. While I was working on this book, I got a telephone call. The voice at the other end of the line said, "This is John Murdoch, the young man who went to the platform the night you preached on giving at the pastor's conference in West Texas. I started the giving that netted $30,000 for the youth department." "Yes," I replied, "I remember you well. You were voted in as district youth leader the next year when the other man resigned the office." "That's right," he said. "The Lord changed my life when I stepped out in faith to give. That was the greatest night of my life." John then asked if he could come up and talk with me, which he did about a week later. "Our daughter attends Southwestern College in Texas," he explained, "and they need a new building very badly. I am interested in helping them raise the money to build the building." I made a few suggestions and sent some material home with him outlining the best ways to raise that kind of money. Months passed, and I hadn't heard from him. In October 1994, about the same time I was thinking of contacting John to find out what had happened, he called me. I could tell from his voice he was on cloud 9 as he explained what had happened. At first, I talked to the college committee and suggested we begin by raising $100,000 from the alumni, he told me. But no one gave me the go-ahead to do anything about it, so for a while all I could do was wait. One man was sold on my ideas, John continued, and he was in charge of one of the fundraising meetings for the new building. During the meeting, he asked me to come up to the platform and pray. He told me, if you want to say something, feel free to do so. I knew that was my opportunity. John told the people that the college had asked the alumni to raise the first $100,000. He said, "My wife and I have prayed about it and feel that God is leading us to pledge $5,000 toward the construction of the new building. Now I'm going to pray and ask God to let you know if you are to have a part in giving toward this $100,000, and if so, how much." John said when he prayed, he felt the Spirit of God move over the congregation. People began to raise their hands and tell how much they would give. "I remembered you had told me to keep track of how much was given," John explained. "So I asked someone to add up the pledges as they came in." When this process seemed to be taking a long time, John asked the congregation if they wanted to stop, and everyone shouted, "No, no, don't stop." When the total got to $77,000, John started counting down, telling the people, "Now we only have $23,000 to go." Then, when they got up past $90,000, a man came to the platform with a check for $10,000. At that point, John told the people, "We have to stop, folks. We have over $100,000. John told me, "Everyone involved is excited and believing we can raise the total amount needed for the new building for the college." What were the key factors that led to John's fundraising success? First, John prayed about what he himself was to give until he got an answer from God. Second, John was bold about publicly acknowledging his pledge when the opportunity presented itself. Third, John counted the money as it came in. And fourth, he never urged people to give. He simply invited them to join him in giving. Obedience wins a victory. Several years ago, our good friend, Dr. Richard Dobbins, a clinical psychologist living in Akron, Ohio, asked Estella and me to have lunch with him when he was here in Springfield. Dr. Dobbins mentioned that his national ministry, Emerge, was having their annual dinner meeting in November in conjunction with their yearly board meeting. "This has always been a time to raise money for our work," he explained to us. "I'm especially excited about this year's banquet since a businessman in the East has promised to give $250,000 if we can raise $500,000 that night." "That's wonderful," I exclaimed, wondering why he was telling me this. Since I had previously worked for him as a consultant for almost 2 years, I could tell Dr. Dobbins had something more on his mind. "Would you be willing to come and raise the money in that meeting?" he asked. "If we can make our goal, it would be possible for us to build a headquarters building, which we desperately need." I thought for a moment, knowing that Estella and I had pledged all we should for that year. I felt we couldn't give a substantial amount. "We can't give very much ourselves," I told Dr. Dobbins, "perhaps a token gift of $1,000. "That's fine," he replied. "No," I said, "I think that whoever raises that money should be someone who can give a very substantial amount." "I really want you to be the one to raise the money for us," he urged, asking us to do it anyway. I couldn't turn down a man like Dr. Dobbins. He was doing too great a work, and besides, we loved him like family. "I will do my best," I said. Then I asked, "How many people will be there?" "About 150. My faith level suddenly dropped. I knew I didn't have the faith to believe that we could raise $500,000 with so few in attendance. The day of the banquet, I arrived in Akron and checked into my motel room early. As I was kneeling by the bedside praying, I told God, I don't have the faith for $500,000, and Estella and I have pledged all that is prudent for us this year. But if you let me know that we should give more anyway, Lord, you know I will do it. The Lord made it very clear to me that we should pledge $10,000. I agreed to do it, but my faith for the $500,000 was still lacking. After dinner that night, I stepped to the podium and looked out at the 150 people attending the banquet. I simply told them about the tremendous need for the building and how much depended on our raising $500,000. We then passed out pledge cards. I told the audience about my experience in the motel room that afternoon. The Lord has told me to give $10,000, I said. Then I prayed that God would lead the people as to what they should give. Just write your name and the amount on the pledge card, and the ushers will bring them up, I instructed, trying to sound encouraging. As the cards were brought up, I read the amounts while an accountant added them on his calculator. When I asked for the first subtotal, it was $212,000. Well, I thought, that's probably all we'll get. But the ushers kept bringing up more and more pledge cards. The next subtotal was $316,000. This has to be close to the end, I thought. But the cards kept coming. The next subtotal was $416,000. It was not until then that I felt a tiny spark of faith. Maybe we can reach the $500,000 goal, I said to myself. I didn't ask for another subtotal until all the cards were collected. It was $575,000. But that was not the end. Late pledges brought the total to $700,000. Later, I was able to evaluate why this fundraising event was so successful. 1. Dale Berkey, Dr. Dobbins' consultant, had done a great job planning before the meeting ever took place. 2. Dr. Dobbins and his staff had led in the giving and others had made advance commitments. And 3. My obeying God could have been another key to the success. I don't know. I'm sure it didn't hinder. Today, Emerge Ministries has a beautiful headquarters building, and the pledge Estella and I made was paid very easily. In fact, I feel that we prospered because of our giving. When God asks you to do something, it is never hard to do. He always provides a way and leaves more than He takes. Give until it hurts? One day, while I was waiting to address a district council meeting, I was sitting in an adjoining room as the Vespers service was coming to a close. The young man who was speaking raised his voice and said with considerable authority, "If you haven't given till it hurts, you haven't given." I am sure that the young man was sincere, but I am afraid he was quoting some preacher who was mistaken. This statement has caused a lot of people to feel guilty because their giving did not hurt them in any way, and they have been told that it should hurt them to give. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus says, "Give, and it shall be given unto you, good measure, pressed down, and shaken together, and running over shall men give into your bosom. For with the same measure that ye measure out withal, it shall be measured unto you again." Luke 6:38. This is in the present continuous tense. As long as I keep giving, this is going to keep happening. It shall be given back to me, good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over. And with whatever measure I use in my giving, this same measure shall be used to give back to me. When that happens, it will be good measure, pressed down, and shaken together, and running over. And the bigger the measure I use to give, the bigger the measure used for my returns. This being the case, how could it ever hurt me to obey God in my giving? Some people will say immediately, yes, but it depends on your motive. Jesus just said, "Give and it shall be given unto you." He gave no other conditions to this promise. I think I can safely believe what Jesus said is true. If God has helped me to build a prosperous business so that I can give regularly to His work, is it reasonable to believe that He would ask me to give so much that it would cripple the very business He had helped me to build? Then I would not be able to give at all. To whom was Jesus speaking when He said, "Give, and it shall be given unto you"? Before Him was a multitude of the sick, lame, halt, and blind. In fact, the Bible says, "The common people heard Him gladly." Mark 12:37. When John the Baptist got discouraged in prison, he sent some of his disciples to Jesus to ask, "Are you the one that was to come, or do we look for another?" Jesus' answer was not a yes or no. Instead, He said, "Go and show John again those things which ye do hear and see. The blind receive their sight, and the lame walk. The lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. The dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them." Matthew 11:4 and 5. I think we could assume that most of this multitude were poor people. If giving would simply make people poorer, and if it was not true that giving would come back to us good measure pressed down and shaken together and running over, to speak such a thing to all these poor people would have been cruel, to say the least. Jesus came to help people. To a multitude of poor people He said, "Give, and it shall be given unto you. Good measure, pressed down and shaken together and running over, shall men give into your bosom. For with the same measure that ye measure out withal, or in every circumstance, it shall be measured to you again." I believe Jesus was saying, you start giving, and you'll find it coming back to you even in greater measure than you gave. God's surprise. While I was president of the Bible College in Minneapolis, Richard Dortch, who was the Illinois district superintendent at the time, asked me to serve as interim minister of the Stone Church in Chicago. The congregation had no pastor at the time, so for 9 weeks I flew down on weekends to preach. The church had just finished a new building but had not started to make monthly payments on the construction loan since the closing had not yet taken place. At over $12,000 a month, the congregation was not financially prepared to make that kind of payment. The church board asked me to raise the money since I had done a lot of this kind of work anyway. On Commitment Sunday, I spoke on giving and then prayed that God would let people know what they should pledge on the building. The pledge was to be paid over 1 year's time. Cards were passed out, and I asked them to write their name and the amount they felt God would have them give. After the ushers collected the cards and brought them up to me, I read the amounts aloud while a deacon added the amounts. Although I seldom take note of the name on a card, I did notice Phil and Vicki Epperson's name on a pledge card for $10,000. At the time, Phil was the visitation pastor and had been in that position with the church for 2 years. He had 4 children and received a yearly salary of $21,500. I knew very well that Phil and Vicki could not afford to give $10,000. But I knew also that Phil and Vicki had a close relationship with the Lord. They wouldn't put $10,000 on a pledge card unless God had definitely led them to do it, I told myself. After a successful fund drive to meet the monthly building loan payments, it came time for the church leaders to begin looking for a new pastor. As we considered the kind of man the church needed, the board decided it had to be someone with years of experience, successful and seasoned, everything a large church like that would want in a pastor. To my surprise, after meeting and hearing the first candidate preach, the congregation didn't vote him in as the new pastor. Then I began to hear people saying, "Why can't Phil be our pastor?" Or, "What's the matter with having Phil and Vicky as pastors?" Phil and Vicky were as surprised as anyone about the sudden interest in them. They certainly weren't expecting to assume such a responsible position. I thought Phil was too young. "He's only been in the ministry 2 years and hasn't preached very much," I remarked. They said, "Yes, but through his counseling he has brought 200 people into the church who have become members in the last 2 years." I told the church board, "We should vote on Phil before putting up any more names. I don't think the people will vote anyone else in until they vote on Phil Epperson." A business meeting was promptly announced to vote on Phil as pastor. When the time came, it was almost unanimous. There may have been one no vote. I don't remember for sure. Phil and Vicky have been pastoring the Stone Church in Chicago since the mid-1970s. Things are going great, and God has used them in a wonderful way. Their starting salary as pastor was double what they were getting when they made the $10,000 pledge. You see, they knew God, and God knew they would be able to pay the $10,000. You just can't get hurt obeying God. Asking the right question. Young couples, both beaming, used to come into my office at the college. He wanting to tell me how they met, she wanting to show me the diamond. I have always enjoyed talking to people who are in love, probably because I'm still in love myself. Somewhere in the conversation, I usually asked when the happy event would take place. The answer so many times was 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years. When I asked why they were waiting so long, the answer usually was, "We can't afford to do it any sooner." I've always thought that 2 could live cheaper than 1, especially if they both work. Then, too, I thought of a little rhyme I heard somewhere. The bride, bent with years, leaned over her cane. Her steps, now feeble, need guiding. While down the church aisle, with a wan, toothless smile, the groom in a wheelchair gliding. Now who is this elderly couple thus wed? You'll find when you've closely explored it that this is that rare conservative pair who waited till they could afford it. What can I afford is not the right question to ask. I have talked with millionaires who said they couldn't afford to give, and they really believed it. The right question to ask when any legitimate need is presented is, what does God want to channel through me? Asking the right questions always helps me to give happily and enthusiastically. Sometimes we raise money for special projects at church and call it Miracle Sunday. But what size is a miracle? If our giving is a miracle, it could just as easily be a big miracle as a little one, as far as God is concerned. If God lays it on your heart to make a commitment for more money than you have or than you could get, and you are very sure that it is God speaking to you, then you can safely make the commitment, knowing God will supply the money to pay it. There is a secret, however, to this kind of giving. After Estella and I make a pledge, we begin to pay on it as soon as God starts supplying the money to us. As a result, we have never had trouble paying a pledge. That is my advice to all givers. Pay your pledge immediately. Don't wait to get it all. Start sowing as soon as God supplies the seed. Get it into God's hands as soon as possible. Why? because the sooner God gets it, the sooner the harvest will begin. When I was working with Capital Ministries, we were raising money for a church building in Denver, Colorado. During the fundraising, an elderly widow pledged $5,000. The pastor told her no one expected her to do this and that it was too large a pledge for someone of her limited means. She said with a smile, "Look, I know my limitations, but I also know God. The Lord impressed me definitely to pledge this amount, and I know that He will provide the money for me to pay it." I have learned that people can only give happily according to their faith, and this dear widow was happy knowing she was obeying God. 2 weeks later, this lady received a telephone call from a man who was a total stranger to her. He said, "We are a new company just moving into Denver. We like your telephone number and are prepared to pay you $3,000 for it." She had never heard of anything like this, so she called the telephone company. They told her that this was a common practice. This dear lady knew God's voice, and I'm sure He met the rest of her need. Her one act of obedience had a great effect on the entire congregation in that Capital Fund campaign. In fact, she was probably the key to success in raising the money for the new building. You see, God has 1,000 ways to meet your needs and mine, so there is no good reason not to trust Him when you know you are obeying His voice. God always does something special for the happy giver. So what do we have to lose? Chapter 3. Setting the Example. After I was elected superintendent of the Illinois District of the Assemblies of God in 1960, the state denominational leaders faced a serious financial problem. The year before, most of the headquarters property had been forfeited in litigation over the deed. The first order of business after assuming my new position was to approve the purchase of property that the committee had already chosen. The undeveloped 160-acre tract of land located near Carlinville, Illinois, included a 21-acre lake. Although it was a beautiful setting, the rural site had no roads, no buildings, and no lines for electric, sewer, or water. The remote location, which was too far from a fire department, meant that we could not get insurance on the property until we connected up with the city water lines 3 miles away. We also had to put up a water tower and lay pipes to cover 258 lots, plus the buildings. That turned out to be the first of many obstacles we would have to overcome in the months and years ahead. To me, these were mountains that looked too high, but God gave us wisdom and direction from the very beginning. The city of Carlinville turned down our first plan for taking care of sanitation. It seemed like a hard blow at the time, but the state finally approved a simple plan that cost about 1/3 as much as the other and did not require an engineer to be on duty. This not only saved us money in the installation, but it has saved the district hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years and has done a better job. The next requirement for the site was a 50,000-gallon water tower at a price that seemed, at least to us, like a small fortune. An engineer from Peoria, however, found a new 50,000-gallon water tower that had been installed and never used. He was able to buy it for such a small amount of money that it took only $16,000 to buy it, dismantle it, and install it on our grounds. God turned our mountains into molehills with a foolproof plan to handle them over the years. God's plans are always good, and they are always plans we can use and afford if we wait on Him. Little money and faltering faith. With the water tank and sanitation problems solved, Our next adventure involved the building of roads, the running of electrical lines, and the construction of the buildings needed for the headquarters. Aside from the logistical problems, we also faced a financial shortfall. The only money the district had at that time was $7,000 from the sale of Zion Bible Institute. The presbyters decided to use this money to hire a company called City Planners to lay out the ground, buildings, roads, water lines, electric lines, sewer system, and to parcel out the lots that might be for sale, 257 of them. Just the planning and the development took the entire $7,000. It would take another $300,000 to build the necessary facilities for the district headquarters, which in 1960 was big money. The presbyters wanted to borrow the money, but I knew it would have to be repaid. Besides, the district had never borrowed much money except from private individuals, so they had not established credit with lending institutions. Even the bank where they had done business for years would not talk to us about a loan. I felt we must at least try to raise the money. After some persuasion, I got the presbyters to approve a 5-member finance committee, which included myself, to come up with a plan to finance the property and its development. After much prayer, we decided that each of us on the committee would borrow $1,000 and then go to the presbyters to see if they would do likewise. Then we planned to approach others and perhaps raise the money and pay for the project. All 5 of us borrowed our $1,000 and then met with the presbyters. When we presented what to us was a very brilliant and ingenious plan, the board members almost fell out of their chairs in a state of deep shock. When they had recovered enough to talk, we began to hear, "I couldn't borrow that amount of money." Remember, this was 1960, and $1,000 was a lot of money to most folks. "I don't have that kind of credit. My wife would never go for a thing like that," and on and on. The 5 of us on the finance committee had already borrowed our money and paid it into the building fund. Dismay, disappointment, and even anger clouded the faces of some of us, I am sure. One board member did say, "Brother Clark, we don't want to hurt your faith. You have our permission to try it even though we do not think it will work." These were good men. They just hadn't faced anything that big before. I really didn't know what to do. I sincerely wondered if I could work with a group of leaders when not one of the presbyters or district officials would go along with a program that seemed possible to at least 5 men in the district. One of the 5 finance committee members whispered to me, "Don't be discouraged. You can do it. I will help you." I owe that man a great deal for his show of wisdom and encouragement. The plan. Since that time, I have learned that you can't expect many people to give the same amount of money. Giving is learned. We should never condemn people for lack of faith. Instead, we teach them by word and by example. Even then, their faith will vary, and people can only operate happily according to their faith. At that point, I did something I had never done before. I started setting up meetings with pastors and church board members. With nothing to show them but a plot map of the tract layout, I planned to ask them for $1,000. Having preached what I thought were some great sermons on faith, this would be a wonderful opportunity to try them out. I contacted 37 pastors to set up meetings with them and their church boards. 35 of them gave me $1,000, and a few of them gave me $2,000. 2 of the pastors would not allow me to meet their boards, but every one of the 35 that I talked to went along with our plan for giving. I did not approach any of the churches where the presbyters pastored, since these men had already said the plan wouldn't work. But to my amazement, Several of the presbyters came to me and suggested that I set up a meeting with their church board. When they realized that 5 men had given $1,000 each and 35 churches had given $1,000 and a few $2,000, their faith increased and they wanted to join us. 2 things we did right. 1, we set an example. And 2, we asked others to join us in giving a certain amount. Next, I suggested that we ask the ministers to give us a note for $300 and pay it back out of the 50% of their tithe that they were not required to pay to the district. My plan was to have the pastors sign a note which would be made out to the district for $300, payable in 36 monthly payments. The district would sell the notes to the bank with recourse, which means that we guaranteed the note. We would pay the interest, and the minister would pay the payments to the bank, and the district would get the money immediately. When I talked to the banker, he said this would require a decision by the bank board. I made arrangements to meet the board on Tuesday afternoon at 2 o'clock. I arrived a little early, and the president of the bank said they were not quite ready for our meeting. He introduced me to a man who appeared, from his overalls, blue work shirt, and crumpled straw hat, to be an old farmer. We sat and visited. I liked the old gentleman, whose name was Starr. He told me that he owned the big beer warehouses and the milk warehouses for the city. He smiled and said, "I guess you folks wouldn't be in favor of the first one." "I think our folk would patronize the milk business more than the other," I remarked with a laugh. As we continued to talk, I explained to him my plan for the selling of notes to the bank. When the bank board finally called me in for the meeting, I noticed they called my farmer friend too. Once we were seated, I was surprised to see that the bank president and vice president and Mr. Starr were the only ones in the room. The president asked me to outline my plan to them. I did and told them how it would work. "If a minister defaults," I said, "you are to get in touch with me, and I will see that he either takes care of it or that the district pays it." The president asked Mr. Starr what he thought of the plan. Mr. Starr, whom I realized by now was an important board member, replied, "Sounds all right to me." They all agreed and said, "Then it is settled," and the meeting was dismissed. I knew that my brief discussion with the old businessman had paved the way, and I praised the Lord for giving me time to make friends with Mr. Starr before the meeting. Out of all the pastors who signed up to pay the $300, very few, maybe 2 or 3, had any trouble paying those notes. The banker was impressed with the integrity of our people and mentioned this many times to other people. When we began asking pastors to participate in this plan, the presbyters, knowing that the general fund for the district was already low, had said, "If we get the pastors to sign a note to pay out of their tithe, they won't give anything to the district." To our amazement, the tithe to the district began to increase. Every minister who failed to pay 50% of his tithe to the district, as he was committed to do, received a gentle prompting from me. I was always careful, however, to major on the blessing he was missing and not on his lack of faith. I knew that implementing this kind of plan was a dangerous thing to do, but I lived to tell about it and was never voted out of office. Thank God. As a result, we raised over $100,000 and built a 15,000-square-foot auditorium. $31,000 in 30 days. Once the building was underway, we got a letter of commitment from the bank for $86,000 and made plans to build a 24-room facility. Designed to sleep 240 people, each room would be complete with air conditioning, toilets, and showers. Not long after the contractor started building, the bank canceled the line of credit to us without any explanation. Since I had signed an agreement to pay a certain amount at various stages of the completion of the building, it was too late to cancel the building contract. The local people were rather suspicious of us as newcomers anyway. If I didn't have the money to pay those contractors when the bills were due, it would ruin our reputation in the community. I just couldn't think of anything worse that could happen. I worked day and night, running down every lead, but all to no avail. No lending institution would consider us since we had no previous credit record. When the contractor's first bill for $31,000 came to my desk, I knew I had only 30 days to pay it. One day, while praying, I thought of calling Pastor Groover in Alton, Illinois. I knew his church had been building new facilities and was dealing with a local savings and loan institution. I phoned and asked him, "Do you think they might be interested in financing our new facility?" "Let me see," he replied, eager to help us. After talking with the lending institution, he called me back and said they are interested in looking over the property and discussing the possibility of a loan. God is at work, I told myself. It so happened that the two men who really ran the savings and loan were country boys raised on the farm. They fell in love with our beautiful tract of land, and, in fact, I think they wish they had bought the property for themselves. "We'll give you a 20-year loan at 6% on the $280,000 needed to complete the entire project," they told me. As a result, I was able to pay the $31,000 to the contractors within the 30-day limit and did not have to be humiliated in my dealing with the builders. God always has a way to do what He wants done. From that point on, the district organization began to build credit. Our goal was to underwrite loans for churches that needed to build or expand their facilities, but had been unable to get any financing. We also wanted to be able to help new churches get started. A Methodist businessman gave me $8,000 for our work because he liked what he saw happening within our organization. I had never seen $8,000 before at one time. Remember, this was 1961. His act of generosity greatly encouraged me, and I felt it was an indication of what God would do for us in the future. I learned that success brings favor from those who can help you. The prudence of planned giving. I soon learned another lesson. It always costs more to build than you expect. While we were developing the Carlinville property, one statement came up in almost every board meeting. Invariably, someone would say, "I know the budget is tight, but here's a list of things we really need in the new facility." Realizing the importance of the items, the board honored those requests. This made it necessary for me to work almost day and night raising money to keep up with the costs that went beyond the money we had borrowed for the project. Somehow I was able to do it, but I had a feeling the source would eventually dry up and we would be left in an embarrassing situation. One day the Lord impressed me with the idea that I was raising money because I had learned how to do it, but that He wasn't in what I was doing. I immediately stopped raising money. This frightened the presbyters and it frightened me, but I decided to wait it out. Within 2 weeks, 3 pastors talked to me about money for debt retirement on the amount we had already borrowed. They suggested that the churches be asked to give 2% of their general fund to the district for debt retirement and upkeep on our property. The presbyters' board felt good about this, so we decided to have dinner meetings in each of the 10 district sections, inviting the pastors, church boards, and their wives as our guests. These dinners were well attended in every section of the state. It seems that inviting the wives was a very good idea. That way, they were sold on the plan as well as their husbands. My part of the presentation was to deal with pastor board relations, salaries, and fringe benefits. Lynn Blackburn, an insurance executive and one of the greatest salesmen I have ever met, presented the 2% plan. Over 90% of the pastors and board members who attended the meetings approved the plan, agreeing to give 2% of their general fund to the district. In fact, they appeared to be quite happy about it. This was the beginning of a good, solid plan to pay the payments on the project and take care of the upkeep on the property. Although the first year was not a full year, still $18,000 came in. The next year, it was $24,000. The total kept increasing until now it comes to well over $300,000 a year. This kind of planned giving made the operation solid. More and more churches adopted the program. To my surprise, pastors told me that since they started this program of giving 2% to the district, their churches had begun to prosper. God's way is always better than ours, and always successful if handled right. He has proven this to us again and again. The payments on the land were $2,016 per month. I will remember that amount as long as I live, but I also will remember God's faithfulness in providing for every need. As the property grew in value, it continually furnished collateral for us to underwrite millions of dollars in loans to help churches in our state expand and build new churches. This method of planned giving also furnished the foundation for us to finance churches that were starting. Raising money to start new churches. Part of our original plan had been to help new churches get started without undue financial burdens on the pastor and members. We decided to implement the Invade program, which was actually initiated by Bob Schmidtgall. Using the credit of our denomination's state organization, we purchased buildings so new churches would have some place to meet. We also supported the work of the ministry from state funds. In this way, the new pastor and his wife could devote themselves full-time to starting the new church without worrying about their income or having to take a secular job. Although the program gave them 3 years to become self-supporting, many pastors did it in 18 months. We found that this method paid off both financially and spiritually. We suggested to Bible colleges that as a part of their missionary program, they raise the money to start a church. We told them $5,000 was sufficient if they used the money for the ministry and borrowed the money for the building. Then the college could supply the men and the money to start a church in one of the surrounding districts. North Central Bible College was the first college to initiate this program. Dr. G. Raymond Carlson, who was president of the college at that time, asked me to speak in a chapel service and raise the money for the first new church project, which would be in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. 2 things surprised me in that chapel service. One was that the students gave so much. I didn't know at the time that many of them made more money than I did. The other was that Dr. Carlson showed such interest in raising the money. That day he stood on one side of the pulpit and I stood on the other while both of us encouraged the students to give. The amount we needed was raised easily. That often happens when the leadership of a church or organization takes an active part in the fundraising. As a result of our success with the Invade program, the New York district asked me to come and spend a few days helping them to initiate the program. They adopted a similar strategy and became very active in expanding their new church planting program. Seeing other people give. In the spring of 1961, I was called to meet with the National Home Missions Committee in Springfield, Missouri. At that time, Robert Brandt was the director of the Home Missions Department, and Gail Lewis was the executive director. James Hamill was also on the committee. When I presented our program to them, the entire committee got excited and wanted to take it to the General Superintendent, Dr. Zimmerman, who immediately offered his endorsement. Some weeks after my meeting with them, I got a letter from Dr. Zimmerman telling me they would be featuring the starting of a new work at Norwalk, Connecticut, with Harvey Meppelink as the pastor. He invited me to speak in the Friday night service at General Council in Portland, Oregon, and raise the money for the Norwalk work at the close of my message. I knew that this was an opportunity for my name to go down in history, way down, if things didn't go right, but I told them I would give it my best. Like the Apostle Paul had done in 2 Corinthians 9:4-5, I decided to do something about that offering before I got to Jerusalem or Portland. First, I felt I should give $1,000. Then I found a number of friends who promised to do likewise and to bring the offering up to the platform when I asked for it. This way, I was reasonably sure I would have a good offering, regardless of how long the preliminaries continued. As we walked up to the platform to begin the meeting that night, Gail Lewis, the executive director of Home Missions, looked rather pale. He started to say something to me and then mumbled, "No, I better not say anything." I knew he was concerned about the outcome of the meeting. When I was introduced, I didn't take time to tell the audience how humbled I was at being asked to speak. I figured they would know by the end of the service how humbled I should have been without my telling them. I prayed such a short prayer nobody had a chance to get up and leave while I was praying. I had seen that happen before. Although there was a message in tongues and quite a bit of open praise during the message, after 25 minutes I started taking the offering. I told the people that history was in the making that night. We are going to support a man and wife to start a work in Norwalk and pay him from the very beginning, I said. He will be a full-time, non-secular working pastor from the start, doing what God had called him to do, start a church. I paused a moment and then continued. This work is so important that my wife and I are giving $1,000. I went over and handed the check to Bob Brandt, the National Director of Home Missions. Then I asked the audience, how many of you would like to join me in giving $1,000 to this great move of God? A man started up the aisle immediately. When he got close enough, I could see who he was and recognized Enoch Christofferson, the prosperous turkey processor from Turlock, California. He wasn't one of those I had spoken to earlier about giving. That encouraged me, since I knew those of us who had made previous commitments would not be alone in our giving. Then the money started coming up so fast I had to have others on the platform help me pick it up. I never did know exactly how much money was given there that night, but I think we counted up to $25,000. In 1961, that was considered a small fortune. We had 3 things going for us in that fundraising effort. 1, a good cause. 2, boldness. 3, advanced commitments. And 4, open giving. What surprised me most was the tremendous altar service that took place following the taking of the offering. There was a great move of God as pastors of some of our largest churches offered their services to churches that were just starting. This event gave home missions a boost within our denomination all over the nation, and many new churches were started as a result. 2 incentives. 2 incentives motivate people to listen for the voice of God and do whatever He asks us to do. These are, 1, hearing about people who have obeyed God in their giving and learning that the result was always good and not bad. And 2, seeing other people give, especially the leaders. Recently, Don and Bonnie Stuckless, who are missionaries to Spain, visited Estella and me and stayed overnight in our home. We had first known them when I was a district superintendent in Illinois and were eager to hear about their ministry overseas. They told us about their ministry among drug addicts, AIDS patients, and people in trouble with the law. Bonnie is a registered nurse and Don works with the new converts. It is very difficult to raise the support we need for 4 years on the field, Don told us. And besides, the Christians in Spain are asking us to raise $30,000 for a building that they desperately need for the work to continue and prosper. He seemed quite distressed about the burden of raising this extra money. I told him that what the leader gives can do much to bring about a miracle. If you will give $3,000, or 1/10 of the amount, I will give $3,000. Then, when you tell others about the need, you can say you are giving $3,000 and I am giving $3,000, and you will raise it easily. A few months later, however, Don came back through Springfield. After a phone call from Spain, he told me, "We now need $40,000 for the building." Just before they left for Spain, I saw the Stuckless family again and asked Don about the money he had needed. It all came in and was the easiest money I have ever raised, he told me. We even raised our budget for our next 4 years on the field, and God provided it all. The easiest way to raise money is to lead in the giving, and if possible, to give 10% of the amount you need to raise. Then ask others to join you. In Paul's first letter to Timothy, he says, "Be thou an example of the believers." I feel quite sure this would include Timothy's lifestyle and his giving to the cause of Christ. If the leader prays and asks God to direct him in his giving, and then lets the people know what God has spoken to him, this will encourage everyone who hears him. As a result, they will seek to be directed by the Holy Spirit in their giving. If the leader expresses an urgent need for money for a certain cause, others will naturally be interested only as far as the leader is willing to invest in that same urgent need. People learn best by the example and by the attitude of their leaders. Chapter 4. The Key to a Miracle. In August 1970, I was asked by the Board of Regents of North Central Bible College in Minneapolis to take the job of president of the college. At that time, I was in my 11th year as superintendent of the Illinois district, and our earlier struggles with the Carlinville property had finally smoothed out. It looked like better and easier days were ahead for the district, and I never gave the college job serious thought. There were several reasons I didn't want a job like that. I wasn't prepared for it. I didn't have enough education. I really didn't know much about overseeing the college. Besides, I was too old to change to something so entirely different than anything I had ever done. Actually, I just didn't want to do it. This went on for 3 months until finally I began to get under conviction. I said, "Lord, if they make another real effort to get me to take that job, I will at least pray about it." During the October meetings of the Board of Regents of the college, the need for a college president came up again. At the time, I was a member of the board. After some discussion, the board members decided to bring in another man for consideration. With great relief, I went to bed that night feeling everything was settled. The next morning, as I arrived for the day's meeting, all the board members looked as if they had not slept a wink. It was evident they had stayed up and talked long after I had left a meeting the night before. "You are missing God," someone said. "We all feel that you are the man for this job." I responded by saying, "Give me 3 days to pray about it, and I will give you an answer." While I was praying, God not only gave me assurance that He wanted me there, but He also gave me a beautiful promise that He would sustain me. This has always been enough for me, so I gave my word that I would venture into the unknown. With full assurance in my heart, I resigned as district superintendent in Illinois, and Richard Dortch was voted in as my successor. Having Goliath's head. The last part of December 1970, Estella and I moved to Minneapolis. This was a big decision for us, since I was nearly 60 years old and we had no money for retirement. The job itself presented many new challenges, but we had great peace knowing that God had promised He would smooth out the way before us. We felt God definitely led us to a house in Richfield. It was priced at $34,500 and required only $3,000 down. Remember, this was 1970. The district had given us $3,000 as a love offering on our departure, so we had the money for the down payment. When it was all settled, my wife, who is the bookkeeper in our family, said, "We can't possibly meet the budget we have set up." We both felt we had made the right decision in moving to Richfield and also in choosing that particular house, so we just decided to trust God to meet our needs. After I assumed the position and began to study the college's finances, I found that since they had not had a president for some time, the purchase of land and a building across the street had never been funded. The college did not have the cash flow to take care of the payments, and the liabilities were about to overtake the assets. This disturbed me, and later I found that it also disturbed the bank. I have learned that in a crisis, the first thing to do is whatever you can do personally. After that, I knew to go to those in-house and then go outside. I had a very strong impression that my wife and I should give $100 a month to the college. I was reluctant to tell Estella about this since she had already said we couldn't meet the present budget. I am really a very practical businessman, although it may not seem to appear so in this situation. Mustering up my courage, I went to Estella and said, "Honey, I know this sounds crazy, but I just feel we have to give $100 a month to the college." She said, "Well, since we don't have it anyway, why not just go ahead and give it?" In February 1971, we started giving $100 a month to the college, taking it off the top of our income the same way we do with our tithe. At the next college chapel service, I spoke to the students and faculty and gave them the facts. Every way we turn, the lack of money, like a giant Goliath, stands in our path with a drawn sword daring us to move ahead, I said. And we're going to have his head this morning. I told them we needed $200,000 to balance the operation of the college, and that I planned to give $100 a month. Then I said, "If you want to help, lift your hand and say how much you can give." There was a tremendous response. I don't remember the amount pledged. I just know it was very encouraging. Then we did something rather unusual. I don't teach this practice as a doctrine. I just think the Lord wanted us to do it that morning. I quoted Matthew 18:18. "Verily I say unto you, whatsoever ye shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever ye shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." I asked them to join hands all around the chapel and over the platform, and together we would loose $200,000 to come into the college for the general fund. Whether it was right or wrong, I don't know, but $232,000 came in that year, and it cost very little to get it. As a result, the college was able to become current in their operations. What about our own personal budget? Well, God had that under control too. As a newcomer to Minnesota, I had never dreamed that I would get very much outside ministry, since I was not too well known in that state. But calls asking me to speak at churches and organizations started coming in steadily until I was busy nearly every weekend. As a result, we received enough income to meet our needs and make our monthly gift to the college and even have some left over. When you are working in the will of God and obeying Him to the best of your ability, it is amazing how many ways God has of meeting your every need. It always happens when you obey Him. The good and bad news. I arrived at the college during the beginning of the spring semester in 1971. At the close of that semester, the bookkeeper came to me with bad news. We need $17,000 by next Monday, $12,000 on Friday, and $31,000 on July 1st. That was the bad news. The business manager had resigned, the bills at the college were 5 months behind, and the line of credit had been depleted at the bank. To make matters worse, money was needed to operate the college through the summer months. I had never in my life been hit with anything this hard. There was no place to go. Frankly, I didn't know what to do, but I never once doubted that God had sent me there. The good news came Sunday night during the church service in Bloomington, where we attended when we weren't ministering elsewhere. At the close of the service, a young woman whom I did not know pulled on my coat sleeve and handed me an envelope with writing on the outside. I just saw at the bottom the words, "Thus saith the Lord." I put the envelope in my shirt pocket. She never said a word, so I didn't say anything either. That night, as I was getting ready for bed, I was taking the things out of my shirt pocket, and I saw the envelope. I began to read what was written on it. It said, "Be not discouraged, for have I not proven myself to you many, many times? Be not afraid, for I will not fail you, and I will keep my promise unto you. Thus saith the Lord." This was a once-in-a-lifetime happening for me. Later, when I talked with this woman, she said she didn't know who I was or what position I held. She said that at first she felt led to give a prophecy in the service, but the Lord checked her and said, "Write it out and give it to that man over there." She didn't know that I had recently received the shocking news about the college's financial needs. She didn't know that I was facing an overwhelming problem, but God did. He went to the trouble to reassure me in my darkest hour that He had not forgotten the promise He had made when I was asking for guidance about going to Minneapolis. I cannot really tell you how it all happened, but the college was not embarrassed once. At the end of the summer, all bills were current, and we were in the middle of a beautiful revival among the students and staff. Unlocking a miracle. One day in early fall, Dick Vanman, a local building contractor, was in my office. We were searching through old blueprints, looking for the diagram of a wall his men were repairing in one of the college buildings. I noticed that Dick seemed rather preoccupied. Finally, he said, "My wife and I promised God He could have a building we own. We are all ready to sell it. If you want to put it towards funds to build a chapel, you can have it. It will bring about $20,000. Nobody at that time had the remotest idea of building a chapel at North Central Bible College. Although one was desperately needed, I had thought maybe we would have a chapel in the millennium, but even to think of one at that time came as a shock. The next day, when I told my good friend Gunnar Danielson, he said he would be glad to give $20,000 toward the chapel project. Both of these men doubled that amount before the building was finished. Then the students got excited about the idea of a new chapel and gave $25,000 cash in a 3-week period. The excitement continued until we had all the money needed except for $100,000. We weren't worried because we knew it would come in through money that was pledged. The property was purchased on a contract for deed. The agreement in the contract said we couldn't build on the property unless we had all the money, and we could not borrow any of it. Students and faculty began to pray with us about the need to have the entire amount. We all knew that God wanted us to have a new chapel. During this time, a businessman came to me and said, "I will deposit $100,000 in the school's account. It isn't a loan. If you need it, use it. Of course, if you don't need it, you could always give it back." We never needed a penny of it. The people gave the last $100,000, and the businessman got his money back. Plus, we dedicated a beautiful new chapel seating over 1,000 people, debt-free. This was in the spring of 1972, during the tightest financial situation imaginable for the college. Who but God could engineer a happening like that? In fact, Dick Vanman's act of faith and obedience to God triggered the raising of enough money not only to build a beautiful chapel, but also to initiate the completion of the college campus. Again, God had proved that He is a miracle God in one of the lowest times in our financial history. It took a key man to get the ball rolling. God used Dick Vanman to unlock a miracle. At that time, Dick had no construction jobs lined up for his company. By the time he finished building the chapel, however, he had $3 million in contracts. He now builds all over the north-central part of the United States. God has prospered Dick Vanman both spiritually and financially. He told me a few years ago that his business had doubled that year. All his children went to Bible college, and at least 2 are in the ministry. The giving paradox. The next project for the college involved remodeling all the dorm rooms. Estella and I decided to give $3,000 toward this latest improvement effort. That may seem like a lot, but we had discovered that the more we gave, the more money we had left to put into our retirement fund. This sounds like a paradox. Bookkeeping principles indicate that the more you give away, the less you have. But experience told us that the more we gave away, the more we had left. In fact, it seemed the larger the gift we gave, the greater the overflow. With the dormitory remodeling complete, we began to focus on our new building project, an administration building with a large regular-sized gym and a number of much-needed classrooms. There was one hitch, however. The city required that we have more parking before we could proceed with this latest building complex. Estella and I decided to give $5,000 to help build the parking ramps. About this time, a real estate agent came to us and asked to sell our house. We really hadn't thought about selling it and told him, "You could only get what we have in it, perhaps just enough to pay your commission." He said, "Set a high price on it. If it doesn't sell, it just doesn't sell." We set the price so high we didn't think anyone would even make an offer, but the first family who looked at the house bought it. We took about $12,000 of the money from the sale and put it into our retirement funds. Then, for less money than we had paid for the home we sold, we bought a brand new townhouse at a discounted price because it was part of a new development. We couldn't help but be convinced that the more we gave, the more we had left. A dream yet unfulfilled. In the late summer of 1978, we were invited to speak at the morning and evening services at a homecoming for a church in Morris, Illinois, where Elmer Powell and his wife pastored. We had helped them raise the money for their new building some years before. We had a beautiful day with them. During the crowded morning service, we enjoyed a beautiful spirit of worship. In the afternoon, a gospel singing group from Nashville inspired us with their lively music. That evening, I preached to a full house again. After a wonderful altar service, I stepped back from the pulpit to allow the pastor to close the meeting. At that point, Mrs. Powell, the pastor's wife, stood up and said, "I have a word of knowledge from God." She turned to me and said, "Brother Clark, you have a dream that is as yet unfulfilled. It has to do with a building. You have given it up, but a key man will come into the college in a few days, and through him this building will be built. Have faith and listen to him, and it shall be done." I had never had anything like that happen to me before in my life. On the way back home, Estella and I talked about the possible meaning of this word of knowledge. We discussed how I had raised money for the last building, but the city would not let us proceed without additional parking. We had built the parking ramps, but I just hadn't had the courage to start on the large central building that had been planned even before I came to the college. On Wednesday morning following the Sunday at the Powell's Church, Gunnar Danielson called me. He wanted to see me right away, so we set up a meeting for that afternoon. Gunnar told me that he had a plan to raise the $1 million needed to build the last building. He said he would raise the money and do it at his own expense. He asked me to set up a meeting with Dick Banman the next day for lunch. When Gunnar and Dick and I met for lunch, Gunnar began to tell us of his plan to find 100 men who would give $10,000 each. He would travel the nation to do this if he had to, and at his expense. Dick spoke up and said, "I will give $50,000. Gunnar said, "I plan to give $50,000 toward it myself." Then I told them about a word of knowledge that had been given in the meeting on Sunday. Gunnar then explained that early in the morning on Tuesday, God had awakened him and given him this plan, which he brought to us on Wednesday. This confirmed to all of us that this was a plan from God that would eventually bring the long-anticipated building to North Central. Before the building was finished, both of these men gave $100,000 each, double the amount they had originally planned. In late summer of 1978, Estella and I felt that God was allowing us to choose how much to pledge toward the building fund. He seemed to say, "You know what has happened when you gave. You can go ahead and give $10,000 like the others are being asked to give or not, whatever you feel like giving." Over the years, we had been learning to give, and our faith had grown. We had seen what happened when we gave. We said, "Let's go for it." So we borrowed the money and gave the first $10,000 that was given toward the new building. After that step of faith, we noticed certain changes taking place. First, it was easier for us to give $10,000 to other projects and ministries. Then, when we were raising money for the college or other projects, more people began to give $10,000 or more. To top it all off, we were able to put more and more money into our retirement account. I resigned as president of the college in July 1979, and Dr. Don Argy was asked to fill that position. Under his leadership, North Central has become one of the largest Bible colleges in our denomination. The new president and board asked me to stay as chancellor, so I was able to see the new building completed as well as the skyways connecting all the buildings. Now the students don't have to go outside in the cold Minnesota winters to get from one building to another. When I took over as president of the college in 1971, The enrollment was 359 students. It has grown to 1,200, and they need to build again to make more room for the increasing number of students. The leadership there has done an excellent job training young people for the ministry and for life. Key people. When God wanted to preserve civilization, He made a covenant with a man named Noah. When God wanted to call out a people for His name, He chose a man named Abraham. When God needed a man to lead over 2 million people out of bondage in Egypt, He chose a man named Moses. In 1 Samuel 17, when the armies of Israel were stopped for 40 days and humiliated day after day with the challenge of Goliath, God sent a man named David to take care of the stalemate. God uses everyone who allows Him to use them, but some people are key people in God's program. Without these key people, certain things would never get done. God seems to depend a lot on leaders, people who will take the first step even in an uncertain battle. When I was district superintendent, I learned that if we found the right man for a position or a pastorate, nothing could stop him. Anyone can be one of God's key people. All it takes is obedience to the revealed will of God. God is obligated to let His leaders know what they should do. If you look back over the stories of great victories in this book, you will usually find that each was started by one person. The key is usually someone who simply unlocks a need with his faith and gets things started in the right direction. In 1 Samuel 14, we read that Saul's army is hiding from the Philistines. Saul's son Jonathan says to his armor-bearer, "Come, let us go over unto the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us. For there is no restraint to the Lord to save by many or by few." The Lord needed Saul's army to mop up, but it was Jonathan who single-handedly won one of the greatest victories Israel ever had over the Philistines. God uses key people to break through barriers that say, "You cannot pass through." Key people break down the barriers by obedience to God's revealed will to them. Are you one of God's key people? You can be. Chapter 5. The Power of Giving Openly. In 1968, while I was district superintendent for the state of Illinois, we were starting a new church in a predominantly black section of Chicago. Thurman Faison, a fine young man, had been chosen as pastor for this new church. During our denomination's Ministers' Institute in Granite City, Pastor Faison gave a brief message about his goals for this inner-city work. Richard Dortch, who was secretary-treasurer of the district, had charge of the service that evening. Just as he was ready to have me introduce the night speaker, a young man stood up and asked for Richard Dortch's attention. He said, "I went to St. Louis today to buy a suit. I didn't find one I liked. Could I give this $150 to the work Brother Faison is starting in Chicago?" The young man walked up and handed Richard Dortch the check. Suddenly, spontaneous praise broke out over the audience. Then a lady stood and said, "I have money at home I call my sugar bowl money. I'd like to give that also." There was continued praise, and one after another people began to rise and tell what they wanted to give. Richard Dortch never asked for money. He just worshiped with them, and people kept giving and praising God for over a half hour. When they were through, the people had given nearly $2,000. Talk about cheerful givers. Nobody who was there will ever forget that service. What if that young man had quietly come to the platform and handed the check to Richard Dortch? The giving would have ended right there. Giving to God openly, however, caused a spirit of giving to fall upon the entire congregation. As a result, what that young man gave was multiplied at least 10 times. The key to success. In the Gospel of Mark, we read that Jesus was watching people cast their money into the treasury in the temple. The Bible says he was sitting over against or right by the treasury, Mark 12:41-44. It seems anyone who so desired could watch the procession of givers. My understanding is that the amount of each gift was loudly announced as it was placed in the offering container. This was an example of giving directly to God's work. In the Bible, giving to God is always done openly. Why then did Jesus say, "When thou doest alms, let not thy left hand know what thy right hand doeth, that thy Father which seeth in secret himself shall reward thee openly"? Matthew 6:3-4. The answer is that alms is money given to the poor and needy. God is not poor, so Jesus is not talking about the money we give to God for the work of His kingdom. Giving our offerings openly to God benefits all concerned. In fact, giving openly to God's work will increase normal giving by about 10 times if it is done with the right attitude. The Apostle Paul says to young Timothy, "Be thou an example of the believers." 1 Timothy 4:12. My experience has led me to believe that giving is a very important part of that example. In 1 Chronicles 29:3-5, David tells exactly how much he has personally given toward the building of Solomon's temple, $17.28 billion. Then the leaders of Israel gave, and the Bible tells what they had given as a group, $31.92 billion. Then the leaders went to the people, and they gave willingly and openly until there was more than enough to build the temple. I consider this a good formula for raising money for buildings or special projects. As a leader, I have always given first to anything that I asked people to give to, especially if it concerned me the same as it did them. Then I would let them know what I gave. People judge your sincerity by how much you yourself are willing to invest in the project you are asking them to give toward. This just could be the key to success in funding that project. Recently, I was called to conduct a capital fund campaign in a church of about 300. We need to build, the pastor told me, and I am asking for a miracle. It will take $200,000 for the building fund, and the yearly income from the church is not too much higher than that. "You're right," I replied. "It will take a miracle." Then I said, "If you and your wife are planning to give a substantial amount toward the fund, it will work wonders if you tell the people or allow me to tell them." The Friday night dinner meeting went well. We had a good crowd and a very open service. People were relaxed and happy. In the Saturday morning meeting, the blank pledge from leaders was lower than I thought it should be. The leaders usually give 50 to 60% of what is given in a fund campaign. On Sunday morning, I had just finished speaking and was ready to take pledges from the congregation when the pastor came back on the platform and interrupted me. "I would like to say something," he told the people. "My wife and I plan to give $5,000, but God has spoken to both our hearts, and we have decided to raise our pledge to $10,000. That did it. When the last pledge came in, the total pledged for 1 year was $201,000. When I later spoke with the pastor, he said, "The pledges are steadily coming in, and amazingly, the giving to the church's general fund is up." I haven't asked him yet what God has done for him personally, but when a man does what he did, the people see it and God sees it and good things happen. Taking the lead. Every time I see that lovely chapel at Evangel College in Springfield, Missouri, I thank God. It is a credit to everyone who was connected with that project in any way. Paying for the construction of the chapel, however, became a great challenge to the faith of all of us who loved the college and knew the great people it had trained for life. We were also aware of the tremendous needs the college would face in the future. At that time, I was working for the general council of our denomination as a consultant to the general superintendent on educational finance. Because of this, I was called in to meet with the executive officials and Dr. Spence, the president of the college, on various occasions. Glenn Cole, the regional executive for the West Coast region, spoke up in one of the meetings and said, "I would like to try raising money for the chapel at the General Presbyters meeting 2 weeks from now." We all knew that such a proposal, to say the least, took a large amount of courage. Nothing like this had ever been tried in the Presbyters meeting, but Glenn Cole felt that God would bless our efforts. The general superintendent appointed a committee to plan for the fundraising, which would take place on the first night of the Presbyters meeting. Glenn Cole was the chairman, and Bob Schmidgall, Clinton Van Zandt, Dr. Spence, and I made up the committee. We had our first planning committee meeting at the Springfield Ramada Inn in the evening. Each of the three pastors, Cole, Schmidgall, and Van Zandt, said that their church would give $25,000 each toward the new chapel. Bob Spence and I both decided we would each personally give $10,000. We then discussed who among us would contact churches and the districts to ask them to pledge $25,000 and who would contact individuals for $10,000. Next, we determined which churches, districts, and individuals would be contacted. Then, to set a good example, we decided that all pledges would be made publicly. We would go to the mic at the presbyters' meeting and tell what God had laid on our hearts to give. In fact, one of the resident executives had promised me he would publicly make his pledge for $10,000. The intervening time between our committee meeting to the general presbyters' meeting was spent making telephone calls or personal contacts with those who might join us in pledging a substantial amount to pay off the debt on the chapel. We set the example and asked others to join us. I don't know anything that works better than this method of raising money. On the night of the proposed fundraiser, Glenn Cole, as usual, did a masterful job of presenting the financial need for the chapel at Evangel College. Then he told the presbyters that his church had pledged $25,000. I think Bob Schmidgall was next. He came to the mic and told them his church would give $25,000. Then one of the individuals we had previously contacted came to the mic and pledged $10,000. Phil Wanamaker was next. After saying some very complimentary things about the personnel from Evangel and Central Bible College, he made his pledge for $25,000 from his church. Then something wonderful happened at that meeting. The whole place was swept with praise, and God began to move on the hearts of those present. One of the executives who had been contacted previously walked to the mic and pledged $10,000. Then another did the same thing, and others stood and gave varying amounts. From the time that Phil stopped speaking, nobody urged the people present to give more or even to give at all. They just got up one by one and went to the mic and said a few things about the colleges and then made a pledge. Every time this happened, a happy, joyous excitement filled the place. When the people had finally finished giving, they had pledged $740,000. The amount given that night broke the back of the debt on Evangel College Chapel. People can get excited about giving when three things happen. 1, they see a real need. 2, the spirit of giving fills a place. And 3, they see others stepping out in faith. Then it is easy for them to move with the tide. I believe that God was pleased with Glenn Cole for having the courage to do what he did. Someone has to lead in any venture, and he volunteered to lead. I believe a number of things contributed to the success of this venture. 1, someone had to be willing to take a bold step and present the need. Glenn Cole volunteered. 2, substantial advance commitments were made by the planning committee. 3, the committee members asked others to join them in giving the same amounts they themselves had pledged. And 4, the giving was done publicly, setting an example for everyone who was there. That General Presbyters meeting was one of the greatest examples of hilarious giving I have ever witnessed. I am sure that all those who attended will never forget that evening. It was like a once-in-a-lifetime experience, happy, joyous, and spontaneous right down to the end. The King David Principle. In the early 1950s, Arvid Kingsrider started a church in Bloomington, Minnesota. He is a great pastor, and the church steadily grew. The congregation had just moved into a beautiful new church building when our family started attending there in early 1971. At the time, I was president of North Central Bible College, and we made our church home there as long as we lived in the Minneapolis area. The church was alive. People were regularly accepting Christ and being filled with the Spirit. In the mid-1970s, it became evident that the present church building, although practically new, would not accommodate the growth that was taking place. To enlarge, however, meant that a new location with land for further expansion was necessary. The church finally settled on a vacant school building in their area. It was in good repair and came with 17 acres of land. All the congregation would need to do was build a sanctuary to seat about 3,200 people. Since the building would cost several $1 million, a capital fund campaign was initiated to raise money. The church had 2 fund campaigns, as I recall. Although they were receiving $14,500 per week, they needed $19,500 per week. It was at this time that Pastor Kingsrider expressed an interest in having me help him with the funding. I told him I would need to come to his office and talk with him about it. When I got there, I met with the pastor and Joel Stalker, his associate. Knowing that Pastor Kingsrider rarely mentioned money during the regular church services, I explained my method of fundraising. I told them I believed in an open approach to raising money in the church, citing 1 Chronicles 29. This chapter tells exactly the amount of money King David and Israel's leaders gave toward the building of Solomon's temple, I explained. Then the leaders went to the people, and they gave willingly after the leaders had given publicly. Every need was met, and there was great rejoicing in the whole congregation of Israel. Pastor Kingsrider told me, "Do anything you want to do," and we set a date for the Capital Fund campaign. God's promise for victory. Before I could begin working with them, I had to complete a home missions tour of North Dakota. While I was traveling, I prayed much about the upcoming fundraising drive. It is not always easy to conduct a campaign in your own home church, but God reassured me that the people would give if they were only challenged to do so. God reminded me that the church was full of wonderful Christian people who were prosperous but who really didn't know how much to give toward a new church building. Few people realize that it takes major amounts of money to make a down payment on a church costing several $1,000,000. The Lord made a promise to me. He said, "If you will give $15,000 and tell the people openly what you are giving and why, I will give that church a real victory and every need will be supplied." At that time, Estella and I had never given that amount of money to any one project before. Such a gift was substantial for us, and it was equal to about half the salary I was receiving as president of the college. When I talked it over with Estella, she also felt very strongly that it was God speaking to us. We decided to make the pledge and pay it out of our retirement savings if we had to, even though we didn't have all that much and I was 70 years old at the time. On the Saturday night before the Capital Fund campaign was to begin, we had a leadership meeting that included all staff members and others who were considered leaders in the church. I told them, God has laid on our hearts to give $15,000. Then I asked each person present for a blank commitment. I would like each of you to take a card and write the amount you would pledge if you were pledging right now, but I don't want you to sign your name. Then we added the amounts on the cards and gave them the total. I knew that the leadership in a church usually gives about 1/2 of the amount given in a capital fund campaign. I had also learned that when you take these blank pledges on Saturday, most of the leaders will increase their pledge on Sunday morning. But the Saturday night meeting causes the leadership to begin praying about giving. On Sunday morning, God gave us a very open service as people were very free to give with no embarrassment. I told the congregation the amount that Estella and I were giving. Then, before handing out the cards for their pledges, I told the people what the leadership had pledged to give. It came to something over $300,000, if I remember correctly. When the congregation heard what had already been pledged, a new freedom in giving began. More commitments of $10,000, $15,000, and $20,000 came in than had been given in any of the church's previous fund campaigns. The reason for the success of this fundraising endeavor, I believe, was simply the open, public giving of what everyone knew was a very substantial amount for Estella and I, and our giving it happily and confidently. Also, we had the assurance that giving what God asked us to give would never hurt us in any way. In that, God proved himself faithful once again. Heavenly Treasure in Bloomington. When Estella and I pledged the money for the building campaign, it never even crossed our minds that we had loaned $15,000 to 2 of our friends. It was loaned for 30 days to one and 90 days to the other. In the meantime, their businesses had simply failed. They couldn't pay, and we had simply written off the debt. To my surprise, one of them called me on the telephone just a short time after we had made our pledge of $15,000 to the church. He said he had the money and the back interest for me. Not long afterward, the other man wrote and said he would be sending $600 a month until his debt was paid. As a result, Estella and I paid our pledge in 6 months and never took a penny out of our savings. In fact, we were better off financially after we paid the pledge than we were before. Isn't that just like the wonderful God that we serve? How does he do it? Who cares as long as he does it? Our obeying God caused the Bloomington church to start giving more until they had enough to build. And rather than depleting our personal store, our giving increased what we had in our retirement funds. About 3 years later, after the Bloomington congregation had moved into their beautiful new sanctuary, I talked with Pastor Kingsrider. He said, "The church has increased in attendance from about 800 to 1,800, and the income has climbed from $14,500 per week to over $35,000 per week." Since then, Pastor Kingsrider has retired, but the church continues to grow. In fact, 100 people from the Bloomington church are starting a new church in another part of the city, and it too continues to grow and prosper. That $15,000 was one of the best investments Estella and I ever made. As Jesus said, "Lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven." Since that time, one after another, again and again, I have seen great financial moves of God because someone gave an amount God had laid on that person's heart. Of course, it was always an amount substantial enough to make a difference. When it can be announced openly that a certain amount had been given by an individual, that gives other people the confidence to believe it is possible to raise the amount of money for a particular project. I have never heard anyone say, "I will give so much if others will give so much." Instead, gifts of faith are given with no strings attached, making it possible for people to praise God for the beginning of a miracle. Then, as they see it unfolding before them, everyone wants to be part of the miracle. Giving openly makes the difference every time. Chapter 6. Taking the Fear Out of Giving. In 1980, I was asked to be the speaker for our denomination's district council in North Carolina, where Charles Cookman was the superintendent. I had been with the Cookmans in a number of meetings through the years, and my wife and I looked forward to this time of fellowship with him and his people. The North Carolina district had set a district goal of starting 120 new churches in the decade of the 1980s. It always thrills me to see people thinking big. God is a big God. If we are going into partnership with Him, most of us need to raise our sights. It was the last morning of the meeting, and I asked Charles Cookman, "If I feel led, would it be all right to take an offering?" "Feel perfectly free," he replied. I preached on giving, and at the close of my message I told the people, "Your goal is admirable, and I believe God is pleased with it." Then I said, "My wife and I would like to give $1,000 toward meeting the goal of starting 120 new churches. If anyone else feels led to give toward this great project, just lift your hand and let us know what you would like to do." The pastor of the strongest church in the district raised his hand and asked, "May I come to the platform?" "Our church has gone through a very difficult time financially," he said, tears streaming down his face. "God had to deal with us about our giving. When our congregation started giving more, we pulled out of the slump, and a miracle took place in the business affairs of the church." The pastor made a large pledge toward the offering and then took his seat. A spirit of praise swept over the entire audience. People started going to the microphones scattered over the auditorium. They kept making commitments and praising God until I noticed that it was past time for the other service to start. I asked Superintendent Cookman if we shouldn't stop. He said, "Oh no, don't stop now." When they were through praising God and giving, the people had pledged about $320,000. My wife and I had invested $1,000 and saw a return of 320 times that much. I'd say that was a very good investment. As a result of that initial meeting, the interest in home missions and church planting has continued with real strength in that district. 3 things contributed to this success. 1, we told the people what happens to givers. 2, we led in giving publicly with our $1,000 gift. And 3, one of their own set an example and encouraged others to give. God's people are only human. They need reassurances. Even the widow of Zarephath, whom we admire so much, 1 Kings 17:13 and 14, needed some encouragement. She did not bake a cake for Elijah until after Elijah had told her that if she did, the meal barrel would not fail and her cruse of oil would not go dry until the famine was over. Then she obeyed God and was blessed. People need to be told what God does for givers. Good things always happen to givers who obey God in their giving. Giving without guilt. When someone is taking an offering or raising money, fear will often creep in and take over. If he says, "I'm not going to apologize for taking an offering," he has already done it. Why plant a negative idea in the minds of the people at the very outset? If you are not going to apologize, don't apologize. Or if he says, "Men are more important than money," he is stating the obvious. If, however, we have the men and do not have the money, money becomes all important at that point. Or he may play the guilt card by saying, "People are more important than buildings." Again, we all know that, but not if you have the people and no place to put them without additional buildings. In 2 Corinthians 9:6, the Apostle Paul is still talking about the offering for the famine sufferers in Judea. He says, "But this I say, he which soweth sparingly shall reap also sparingly, and he which soweth bountifully shall reap also bountifully." This is good news to the giver and helps us to give happily and joyfully unto the Lord, knowing we can honor God with our giving, and it will be like seed sown. It will bring in a harvest to us according to the amount of seed sown. I hear much talk today of those who have given sacrificially to the work of God. It seems to imply that they have suffered and bled for His cause through their giving. Sacrifice is an Old Testament word. Back then, it simply meant honoring God as Creator, Savior, and Redeemer with a gift. Today, it means suffering or doing without. Could it be possible that when David sacrificed 1,000 bullocks to the Lord, that he had to go without other necessities until he made up for this gap in his budget? Or that he couldn't trade for a new chariot when the new models came out because he had given so much to God? No, he gave out of his abundance, and I believe God was pleased because God had given him the very abundance from which he gave. The Apostle Paul says, "Not grudgingly or of necessity," 2 Corinthians 9:7. Giving must be free-flowing to be happy giving. Paul continues, "Every man according as he purposeth in his heart, so let him give." Let the man decide, but there are ways of helping him to decide what God wants him to give. The amount of money a man has in the bank has very little to do with what he gives. Every person has to learn to be a giver. We all need teachers to teach us how to hear the voice of God. We also need to be taught why we can safely trust His voice when we are sure we have heard His voice. The teacher is usually the man taking the offering, the commitments, or the pledges. It stands to reason that it makes a great difference what kind of man he is and what his experience in giving has been. Nobody can teach people better how to give like a giver, that is, one who has learned to give without fear. A giver is a person who has learned that it can never hurt to give whatever God has asked you to give. Willing-hearted givers. The Bible asks, "Hath not God chosen the poor of this world rich in faith?" James 2:5. God doesn't have to have millionaires to do His work. It is wonderful when He can use men of means, but He is not limited to that class of people. I have known millionaires who have been a tremendous blessing to me in the work God had called me to do. I have also known people of very moderate means who have helped me in a great way, too. Rich or poor, People have to learn to give. Some years ago, I was invited to come to Greeley, Colorado to raise money for a church building. They needed $100,000 to get started with the construction. During the Saturday night leadership meeting before commitments were to be taken the next morning, the treasurer of the church wrote on the blackboard that they needed $100,000 and that the church had 100 giving units. He was implying that if each person gave $1,000, the money for the new building could easily be raised. I explained to the church leaders that it never works that way. You cannot apportion the need out over a congregation, expecting that each one will give a certain amount for any given project. Some, for various reasons, will not give anything. Others will give varying amounts, but usually about 20% of the people will give 80% of what is given. Sometimes 10% of the people will give 90% of whatever is given. I told them, all we can do is explain fully what the money is needed for and how much is needed. Then we must try our best to get people in touch with God so they can hear His voice. One way to do this is to provide examples of what happens to people who obey God. The people will realize that they can expect God to let them know what they are to give and that He will bless them. Then we must leave the result to the people and to God. The next morning, 9 people in that congregation pledged $90,000. One man pledged $20,000, and the other 8 pledged sums on down to $5,000. The other 91 giving units pledged $12,000 total. The church leaders were amazed to discover that the 9 who pledged $90,000 were not those who had the most money. Instead, they were the people who had learned to give as God directed them. I reminded the congregation that when God wanted buildings in the Old Testament times, He asked those who were willing-hearted to bring free will offerings. Exodus 35, 5-22. That morning in Greeley, the money was given freely by people who were willing-hearted. Our part is to praise God that the need is supplied. We should not even bring to the congregation's attention that some supplied more than others. Seeing others giving freely and happily is the best way for people to learn not to be afraid to obey God's voice. Asking for specific amounts. There are times when asking people for a certain amount of money is the easiest way to raise the amount you need. For 2 years, I worked as a consultant for clinical psychologist Dr. Richard Dobbins of Akron, Ohio. In making a study of his ministry's needs, I found that for some time they had envisioned the advantage of making a teaching video that would allow Dr. Dobbins to speak to more people. This would, of course, multiply his usefulness many times over. We found that a video could be made professionally for $85,000 at that time. I told Dr. Dobbins that I thought I could raise that small amount of money on the telephone if he would furnish me with a list of people who had been helped by his ministry. This was easily arranged. In this approach, the first thing I had to do was to decide to give whatever I asked people to give. When raising money this way, it is very important to pray about the amount and be willing to be the first to give. Then simply ask people to join you. I decided on $5,000. Then I asked Dr. Dobbins if he would join me in giving that amount so that I could tell those I contacted that we had both led in the giving. He wholeheartedly agreed. The first 3 contacts in any fundraising venture are of utmost importance. After that, a trend is started, and the task gets easier with each subsequent call. A typical response came from a man in Florida whom I had never met. After talking with him about why we were trying to produce a video for Dr. Dobbins and how important it would be in his work, I told him that I and others were each giving $5,000. Then I asked if he would like to join us in procuring this tool to make Dr. Dobbin's ministry even more effective than it was. We talked about other matters for some time. I asked him about his work, and we had a very pleasant conversation. Then he asked, "How much did you say you were giving?" I replied, $5,000. "Oh, that isn't all that much," he said. "Where shall I send it?" I made it a practice to have a nice, unhurried conversation with each person about what they were doing, whether they gave money or not. Then I would ask if they had any special need that I could pray with them about on the telephone. The advantage of asking for $5,000 is that if I had just asked him to help us, he could have said he would give $100, and all I could do would be to thank him. With that approach, I would have to call 850 people to get this job done, not to count the time and the expense of the telephone calls. When I was working with Jack Strom, president of Capital Ministries, he talked to me about the need that year to raise money for Christian education. When I left North Central Bible College in 1981, I felt God had released me from any further involvement with education, I told him. I really don't want anything to do with it. He still wanted to talk with Dr. Zimmerman, our denomination's general superintendent. "Don't make any arrangements that include me," I said. Dr. Zimmerman called me sometime later and asked if I would come in and talk with him. I told him I would, but I was still fully determined to stay out of funding for education. When we had talked together, he suggested that we pray. Well, either that place was shaken or the Lord shook me, but it was like heaven came down. I felt that this was an indication to me that I should do whatever Dr. Zimmerman was asking me to do. So we worked out arrangements, and I went back to the motel. I awakened sometime in the night, and God began to let me know what I should do. I felt good about seeing how many churches in our denomination I could get to give $1,000 per month to Christian education. I had felt for a long time that our greatest weakness concerning education was that not enough churches gave large amounts to do what needed to be done for our colleges. Then I remembered how much easier it was to get people to do something if I myself was doing whatever I asked them to do. I decided that I would give $1,000 a month, just as I was asking them to do. I believe God brought this to my mind. Then I thought, if the general superintendent would join me in giving $1,000 a month to college ministries, that would greatly encourage the people I would be contacting. The next morning, I went by Dr. Zimmerman's office and asked if he would like to join me in giving $1,000 a month to the college ministries. He said he would do it, and he did it very faithfully. The first pastor I talked to was David Crabtree, a pastor in Des Moines, Iowa. His church was the first to join us. The next was Arvid Kingsrider, pastor in Bloomington, Minnesota. Now we had $4,000 per month pledged. From then on, I started using the telephone, and churches all over the nation began to pledge this amount of money. At the end of 2 years, I felt I had done all that I could do in that field. We had contacted about 200 of the larger churches with overwhelming success. I resigned from the job, but I know it left a definite effect on the giving of larger amounts to education in our denomination. What it cost was well spent, and the money I gave was a very good investment. The reluctant fundraiser. Many times opportunities slip in at the back door, and we do not recognize them as opportunities. Sometimes we treat them as extra burdens. I was walking down the hall at North Central Bible College one morning when I met Sherman Bushow, the pastor of the Anoka Church. His congregation had just completed a new church building and were having the dedication the next Sunday afternoon. I said, "Hey, Sherm, I will be in town this weekend, so I'm planning to come to your dedication. I have never seen your new facility." "Great," he replied. "I'll have you take the offering. We have been fasting and praying about a shortage of $5,500. Raising money at church dedications is not my first love. I knew the church would be filled with people from the community and other important guests. The mayor would be speaking, the head of the ministerial alliance would be greeting people, a member of the city council would probably attend, and all the executive officers of the district, plus the assistant general superintendent, would be speaking. One of my friends said, "Why don't you tell the pastor you'll be out of town?" "I already told him I would be in town," I answered. I planned to attend the dedication, but I was dragging my feet. I got there early and asked Pastor Bushow just how important is this offering. He said, "Oh, E.M., we have to have that money. The amount is now $7,500, and we have outstanding bills that must be paid. We have raised all we can, and today is our only hope." He convinced me that he needed the money, but I knew it would take time to raise that amount. I thought about how to proceed. I could tell the people funny stories and how much money the church needed and then pass the offering bags, but it would never come in, not at a dedication. So, in spite of the fact that all the city fathers were there and visitors made up most of the congregation, I decided to do my best to get the money for the pastor. When I was introduced, I told those assembled how hard it is to build a church. "I have built 4 of them in my pastoral work," I said, explaining how much help from others was needed and appreciated. I told them that the church had an urgent need for $7,500 to clean up some outstanding bills. Then I prayed, "Lord God, use this crowd gathered today to help this church with the money they need." I told them that I would give $200 and then asked them to simply raise their hand and let me know what they would like to do to help us raise $7,500. In the beginning, I had $100 given on the platform. Then a man holding a child on his lap raised his hand and said that they would give $600. Then something happened. The presence of God entered that place, and people began to give freely. One man raised his hand and said he would give $1,400. This kept up until we had $5,600 committed. I felt we had taken up all the time we should and told the folk we would now pass the offering bags. In my heart, I knew there would be $7,500 in the offering. I told the ushers to count the offering and when the service was ended to let us know how much was raised. When G. Raymond Carlson, the Assistant General Superintendent, had finished preaching, an usher brought up a slip of paper and handed it to him. He announced the amount of the offering. It was $7,600. On Monday morning, Pastor Bushow and his wife met me in the hall at the college. With beaming faces, they said, "E.M., the whole city of Anoka is talking about that offering that was taken yesterday afternoon. They say they have never seen anything like it. That's the most exciting thing that has happened in Anoka in a long time." When I thought how I had tried to get out of what had appeared to me to be a hopeless situation, I had to repent and promise God I would try much harder to recognize His leading in the future. In the story of the talents from Matthew 25, Jesus is giving us a preview of what will happen when we have to give account of how we have used whatever talents God has given us. He makes it very clear that He expects us to use our talents and to increase them as time goes on. We can do that by being open to instruction from others and learning, usually from our own mistakes, what works and what doesn't. Most important, we need to be open to correction and to seek God's direction afresh for every situation, because no two are exactly the same. The best investment we can ever make. Jesus said, "Lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through nor steal." Matthew 6:20. All the treasure we lay up there will have to be done while we are down here. If it wouldn't do us any good to lay up treasure in heaven, I can't understand why Jesus would ever have advised us to do it. I believe heaven will be just as real as the world we live in here on earth, and what we lay up there will affect us throughout eternity. When Paul was writing a thank you letter to the Philippians for an offering they had sent to him for his support, he said, "Not because I desire a gift, but I desire fruit that may abound to your account." Philippians 4:17. That means we must have an account up there, and God keeps it so there will be no mistakes. Every time we give in God's will, we add to that account. In 2 Corinthians 9, where Paul is collecting money for the famine sufferers in Jerusalem, he says in verse 6, "But this I say, he which soweth sparingly shall reap also sparingly, and he which soweth bountifully shall reap also bountifully." Jesus tells us about the sower who went out to sow in Matthew 13:8. "But other fell into good ground and brought forth fruit, some 100-fold, some 60-fold, some 30-fold. It is evident from these passages that it pays to sow in good ground. Buildings that are really needed for the care of the church and its people are most always good ground. Our investment in people is usually good ground. Jesus said that good ground brings forth some 100, some 60, and some 30-fold. This means 100 times more than you sowed, or 60 times more than you sowed, or 30 times more than you sowed. Usually, farmers sow approximately 1 bushel of seed to an acre. So it pays to pray about where you sow. Heaven will be wonderful, but there will be differences among us even in heaven. We will differ, however, only according to rewards given for service. I can't do one thing to save my soul. Jesus paid it all. All the service I can do will not cancel one sin. Nothing but the blood of Jesus will cleanse from sin. The Bible is clear, however, that there certainly will be great differences in rewards for faithfulness and for work done for His name to build up and increase the kingdom of God. So, whatever talent God has given to us should be invested carefully and prayerfully in the work of His kingdom. I have a strong feeling that we will be busy throughout all eternity. In fact, I believe that is what Jesus is talking about in the parable of the talents when He said, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant. Thou hast been faithful over a few things. I will make thee ruler over many things." Matthew 25:21. In Jesus' parable of the talent, the man who received the 1 talent buried it in the earth. It is easy to bury all our talent in the earth or in earthly things, but these have no eternal rewards. When a man dies and his will is probated, the first thing people ask is, what was he worth? He doesn't take a thing with him, so right now he is only worth what he has invested in eternal things. Some years ago, I had breakfast with a businessman who told me, "When I started out in business, I had a goal of giving $1 million to the work of God." Then he told me, "I have had to revise my goal." I thought, I guess he couldn't make it. His explanation, however, surprised me. He said, "I reached that goal long ago. I have had to start working on a new goal." More and more people today are taking seriously the matter of laying up treasure in heaven. I, too, want to be in that number who are concerned about investing in eternity. In 1994, even though retired, we have raised well over $1 million for God's work, mostly for buildings. The Apostle Paul writes, "For our conversation, or our citizenship, is in heaven, from whence also we look for the Savior, the Lord Jesus Christ." Philippians 3:20. We who have accepted Christ are not only citizens of the country where we now live, we are also citizens of a heavenly country. Wise people prepare for life over there just as we prepare for life here. We are only on this earth for a short time, but we will spend eternity in heaven. That does not mean that we neglect to prepare for this life, but that we are also doing all we can to prepare for the life to come. Estella and I have been looking toward heaven for a long time, and that goal has never failed us. We keep making investments up there, and we intend to go there in the not-too-distant future. Until that time, we plan to keep being happy, giving our time and our money away. After all, that's the best investment we could ever make. Chapter 7. Do's and Don'ts of Happy Fundraising. In a luxurious hotel, about 150 special friends of an effective ministry sat down to a lovely and inviting banquet. The leader of this organization had invited his board of directors along with other guests. This once-a-year celebration provided the opportunity to report on the work and hear testimonials from people who had been helped by the ministry. Then the time came to introduce the man who had come to raise money for a much-needed new building. After a prayer and a few introductory remarks, he began asking the people for money. As the meeting progressed, it became increasingly evident that things were not going exactly as he had planned. The man struggled a while and then, in a rather high, authoritative tone, said, "If God hasn't spoken to 25 people here to give $1,000 each, I'm a liar." Since there was no response from his declaration of God's will for 25 people in that room, he turned to the leadership on the platform and said, "There hasn't been enough prayer for this meeting. That's the problem here." After saying some rather uncomplimentary things to the leadership, he asked one of them to stand by him and pray. Although he continued for some time to browbeat the leadership and the people, the offering was small. As a result, this yearly dinner meeting was set back more than a year. After all, who would want to return to be treated in that manner if they have a choice? I have always learned from people things to do and things not to do. While I was head of our national radio department, I was responsible for the Revival Time program from 1951 to 1958. Well, in 1953, the General Council in Milwaukee voted to go live on the ABC network with a full-time speaker, and C.M. Ward was chosen. I worked with Dr. Ward until 1958 when I accepted the pastorate at Bethel Assembly in Quincy, Illinois. C.M. Ward was a master at handling crowds and taking up cash offerings. I learned more from him in these areas than from anyone I have ever known. Permit me to share some of the do's and don'ts of fundraising that I have learned from others and from my own experience over the years. In raising money for God's work, I have discovered that the successful fundraiser must possess certain common characteristics and practice certain principles in their own lives. Few people realize that it is the character and faith of the fundraiser, along with his use of scriptural methods, that determine the success of the venture. The happy fundraiser. Here is how you can become a happy and successful fundraiser. 1. Be a giver yourself. The individual asking people to give money must himself know personally the secret of happy, enthusiastic giving before he can lead others into this way of giving. First of all, he must prepare his own heart to give by seeking the Lord for the amount he personally will donate toward the fundraising effort. Second, he must set the example in giving. The Apostle Paul said to Timothy, "Be thou an example of the believers." 1 Timothy 4:12. This includes many things, but surely among them is the example of being a giver. If the people know what the leader is giving to the project, it gives them a point of reference as to how they should pray about their giving. I have made it a practice to lead in giving whatever I ask others to give and to give it openly. This has helped me to raise money much easier. 2. Be confident in God's goodness. The man who has learned that it never hurts people to obey God in their giving is confident, calm, and relaxed as he raises money for the work of God. He is never nervous when he talks about money. He knows that God meets honest, legitimate needs, and that if properly presented, He will meet the need through His people. The fundraiser's calm, confident spirit of faith imparts itself to those with whom he deals. He makes it easy for people to relax and get in touch with God. In this way, the fundraising simply becomes a matter to be settled between God and whoever is giving. As a result, the fundraiser doesn't oversell. He doesn't threaten. He doesn't make extravagant statements. He never tries to put people under bondage or under guilt. The confident fundraiser majors on what happens to people who obey God rather than what happens to people who disobey God. After all, he will raise his money from people who obey God, not from people who disobey God. So, his business is to encourage people to get in touch with God. The fundraiser's main job is to get God and the people working together on the problem. He must believe that when God calls someone to do something, He supplies the means to get the job done. 3. Recount real-life experiences. The leader must have experienced that it really does pay to give to God. This includes giving to the church, to the poor and needy, and to any other good cause. You can't outgive God. That oft-repeated phrase never held any meaning for me until I began to hear what happened when someone obeyed God in their giving. I find that other people are just like me. They want to know why we should be happy and enthusiastic when we give in the will of God. Nobody is going to rejoice just to get rid of their money. There has to be another reason why people give happily and enthusiastically. What people really need to hear are real-life experiences in which people have obeyed God in their giving and good things have happened to them because of it. The successful fundraiser will have a coffer full of stories from the lives of others and from his own experiences as well. 4. Don't be afraid to challenge the common folk. Every believer wants to support God's work and help people in need. Yet, us common folk must make a living, pay our bills, and care for our families. How can the fundraiser challenge average wage earners to give to God's work above their tithe? In Luke 6:38, Jesus said, "Give, and it shall be given unto you. Good measure, pressed down, and shaken together, and running over, shall men give into your bosom. For with the same measure that ye mete, or measure out to others, withal, in every instance, it shall be measured to you again." When he made this statement, Jesus was speaking to a great multitude. Later, John the Baptist, who was languishing in prison at the time, sent one of his followers to ask Jesus, Art thou he that should come, or look we for another? Luke 7:20. One of the proofs Jesus sent back to John was, the poor have the gospel preached to them. In the midst of this multitude of sick, crippled, maimed, blind, deaf, and poor, Jesus said, "Give." Why would Jesus ask such a destitute crowd to give if it was just to get rid of what little money they had? This would have been not only illogical, but cruel. The secret here is, with what measure you use to give in every instance, that same measure will be used to give back to you, only it will be good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over when it comes back into your bosom. This promise gives reason and logic to what Jesus is asking the people to do. It also gives them something to rejoice about. No wonder the common people heard him gladly. Mark 12:37. 5. Talk about blessings, not duty. Don't create panic. Instead, emphasize the blessings that will come to people who obey God. God makes many promises to the giver. Luke 6:38 is still true. Give, and it shall be given unto you. People giving in the will of God will always be blessed. In 2 Corinthians 9, the Apostle Paul is in the midst of a capital fund campaign, trying to raise money to send to the famine sufferers in Palestine. This entire chapter is on giving. In the 6th verse, Paul, who is a very successful fundraiser himself, simply says, "He which soweth sparingly shall reap also sparingly, and he which soweth bountifully shall reap also bountifully." Paul likens giving to sowing. Why? Because the apostle himself must have experienced this law in operation in his own life. Everyone knows that the seed sown in the ground produces a harvest much larger than the original seed. Paul wanted the Corinthians to realize that whatever they gave would be returned to them in ways far greater than their gift could have produced if it had not been given. The successful fundraiser will, like Paul, help people lose their fear of obeying God in their giving. He will convey to his hearers that giving is something to rejoice about, knowing they will reap not only the amount they give, but much more in return. 6. Respect God's people. The successful fundraiser shows respect for others and assumes that people are generous. Never make disparaging remarks about people who do not give, as much as you might like to see them give. They are God's people, and they have to learn to give. Encourage them by example rather than railing at them. Don't ever ask them to do something that you aren't willing to do. Never talk about people who have failed. Only talk about those who have succeeded. This eventually builds faith in the hearts of people. 2 Corinthians 9 provides a wonderful example of how a successful fundraiser should conduct himself. 7. Show your appreciation. The happy fundraiser always praises God and compliments people for their giving, even if the giving hasn't come up to the amount he expected. In fact, he never lets the people feel he is disappointed. Instead, he shows and exudes only thankfulness and enthusiasm. If you do this, the money will eventually come in and you will be able to do what God wants done. Every time money is paid on pledges, let the congregation know and show gratitude to the people for their generosity. They weren't required to give to your project, so when they do, let them know you are not just taking their giving for granted. Thanking people has a tremendously positive effect. We all like to be appreciated. And 8, put giving in eternal perspective. The positive leader will teach the people that in this life there are two worlds we must deal with, the here and the hereafter. Both are real. Jesus said, "Lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt." Inflation can reduce the value greatly, and where thieves break through and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasure in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and thieves do not break through and steal. Matthew 6:19 and 20. This is a principle, not a rule. We must be prudent in our business dealings, and at the same time have the faith to trust God when He asks more of us than we want or can afford to give. In Luke 12:16-21, Jesus tells about a rich farmer who was a successful and no doubt a hard-working man. He prospered. He needed bigger barns. He believed in taking care of what he had. Sounds like a fine, upright, hard-working citizen. Jesus didn't say this man was a sinner. In fact, he could very well have been a believer. Jesus criticized this prosperous farmer because the man said, "There will I bestow all my fruits and my goods." Jesus used strong language and called the man a fool. He then said, "So is he that layeth up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God." Verse 21. God is not against us laying up treasure in this world, but the wise man also lays up treasure for the world that is to come. Positive fundraising principles. The success of the happy fundraiser depends not only on his personal character, but on the methods he uses to raise money. From my experiences, I have gleaned a few principles that have helped make fundraising a positive experience, both for myself and those who were doing the giving. We have already seen in the previous chapters how these principles have worked in actual fundraising situations. These are my suggestions for positive fundraising. 1. Be upfront with the facts. Let the people know exactly what the offering is for and how much is needed. So often we hear the leaders say, "We need a good offering tonight," or "We sure need a lot of money," or "It takes a lot of money to operate." It is always best to say what amount is needed and why. If the money is needed for a building or a project, tell the people how much will be financed and how the payments will be made. Let them know that you have counted the cost before starting. Then they can give confidently to the project, knowing that it is being handled in a safe, business-like manner. We have all heard the cliché, "If everyone will give something, there will be enough." That may sound good, but it is not a good rule to follow or promote. Why? Because your method of fundraising depends on what you are trying to do. If you are taking an offering to buy a car for a pastor, that requires taking one kind of offering. Raising money for a church organ requires a different approach. If you were going to build $1 million church building, much larger offerings will be needed. But it never pays to tell people that they must give larger offerings. Normally, for a $2 million church building, $600,000 of this money should be raised in a capital fund campaign, and the rest could usually be borrowed through conventional financing. To raise this amount, you need several people who will make commitments ahead of time for amounts of $50,000 or more. This gives others the faith to believe that it can be raised, and everyone will make greater commitments if they know that substantial amounts are being committed on the project and there is a chance of reaching the amount needed. These matters should be arranged with the leadership before going to the people. Usually the leaders will give 50 to 60% of whatever is given. When I am raising pledges for a building and the top pledges are $5,000, I know that they are not going to raise very much money regardless how large the church. You just don't build $1 million building on $5,000 commitments. Most Christian people like to give. Many of them, however, do not have the faith to give anything very substantial. As the leader, it is your job to help them to know that if they give prayerfully whatever God has impressed them to give, it will not hurt them, but rather help them both spiritually and financially. 2. Give God time to work. Whenever money is raised, let the people know exactly what it is for and how much is needed, but never say, "We are going to raise the entire amount this morning." If you state you are sure all of the money will be pledged within a certain time frame, you are setting yourself up for disaster. If you fail to make the goal in the time you set, people will feel let down instead of happy. Those who have already given did so generously and happily and as near as they knew God had laid on their hearts to give. If you end the fundraising and leave the congregation with a defeated feeling, it will be almost impossible to raise their level of faith again. It would be best to say, "We need $700,000, and we'll see what God will do for us today." Then whatever God and the people do, you can praise the Lord for it. Afterward, you can compliment the people and let them know that God is still at work and that eventually the need will be supplied. When you approach fundraising this way, money usually keeps coming in, even after all the pledges are taken, until there is enough. 3. Find someone who can lead in giving. Why is a lead-off giver important? Because most people do not believe it is possible to raise the amount of money needed. To bolster their faith, it is of great value to have someone be first to give a substantial amount. Then the faith of the group will rise as they realize that it can be done. There is great value in having someone take the lead in giving. Sometimes the pastor is called on to be the one who starts the giving. Sometimes it is a member of the church, or even someone outside the church or organization. In some cases, it may even be you. On occasion, I have been the one whom God used to start the giving. If God channels money through you, remember, He always leaves more than He takes. 4. Prepare the people to give. In taking up offerings for larger amounts, perhaps to build a building, I first speak on the need and then about what God does for people who obey Him. I then pray for His special guidance for the people there. I never urge people to pledge. I tell them if God doesn't impress them to give a certain amount, not to do anything. I say, if God doesn't let you know what to give, don't do anything, and please do not be embarrassed if you walk out without making a pledge. Simply obey God. The successful fundraiser must present the need before the church or organization in a proper manner. If he does, God will begin to lay on the hearts of the people the amounts needed to meet the goal, whatever it may be. If the need is presented in a scriptural way, most people will give prayerfully as God leads them to give. As they pray, God will lead them to give according to the need and according to their faith. Some have faith for larger gifts, and some only have faith for smaller gifts. People have to learn to give, especially if God leads them to give larger gifts than they ordinarily give. Sometimes God may lead them to give from the means they have. At other times, He may lead them to make commitments for amounts that they do not have. In that case, they have to make the commitment by faith alone. Their giving then becomes a faith operation. In order to do this kind of giving, the individual has to know God and how to hear His voice. 5. Get advance commitments. Sometimes it is helpful to get advance commitments from several people before the final pledges are presented. Is such a practice scriptural? The 9th chapter of 2 Corinthians sheds some light on this matter. It explains how Paul sent certain chosen men ahead to help the church raise money for the famine sufferers in Palestine. Paul wanted to make sure the money was ready to take back to Jerusalem. In some cases, a church or organization may employ experienced fundraisers to seek advance commitments. When done scripturally, this kind of preliminary work can be accomplished successfully without creating friction. Then, as these pledges are presented openly, faith rises and giving from the people as a whole increases. 6. Use open giving. Is open giving scriptural? Yes. Giving openly is biblical and effective. In fact, it can work wonders. Many people have a misconception about this kind of giving because Jesus said, "When thou doest alms, let not thy left hand know what thy right hand doeth." Matthew 6:3. But in this instance, he is talking about alms, which is giving to the poor. Giving to God is certainly not giving to the poor. God is rich. When you give alms, Jesus said, "Don't give as the hypocrites do, simply to be seen of men." In this case, Jesus gave a principle, not a rule. How do we know that? Because then he said, "When thou prayest, enter into thy closet, and when thou hast shut thy door, pray to thy Father which is in secret." Verse 6. We know that he was not banning public prayer. He also said, "Thou shalt not be as the hypocrites, that they may be seen of men." Verse 5. The issue here is motive, not method. In Matthew 26:7, a woman broke an alabaster box of very expensive perfume and poured it on Jesus' head. Some people fussed about it, but Jesus said, "Wheresoever this gospel shall be preached in the whole world, there shall also this, that this woman hath done, be told for a memorial of her." Verse 13. This woman humbly and openly poured out her gift on Jesus. He did not condemn her actions as he had the Pharisees, because Jesus knew that the woman's heart and motives were pure. As a result, her public demonstration has been heralded around the world for almost 2,000 years as an example for all believers. Giving openly can encourage others and inspire them to give. This kind of giving will usually increase the amount of the offering at least 10 times if it is done as a leading from God. And 7, count the offering as it comes in. In almost every place where I have raised money, many in the congregation did not have the faith to believe that the amount needed could be raised. Without faith, people will hold back in their giving because they don't think the goal can be reached. As a result, they don't get serious about giving, or they don't give at all for fear they will be left holding the bag while others get away without giving anything. After I have prepared the people to give, I hand out cards and ask people to write their name and the amount they want to pledge for 1 year. Then I have the ushers collect and bring up the cards as soon as the people have them filled out. As the fundraising leader, I always have someone counting the cash gifts and pledge offerings as soon as they are given. Why? Because I know from experience that at some point in the giving, people will begin to believe the goal can be met. I read the amounts aloud and have someone add them on the adding machine. Then I ask for a subtotal. When the amount is announced, I am always amazed that the subtotal is as large as it is. I am sure the people are also surprised. When that happens, others start to accept the challenge and begin to pray earnestly about the amount God would have them give. As a result, the giving starts to flow more easily. Soon, almost everyone will join in because they want to see the goal reached and don't want to be left out in the final count. Many times the larger pledges come in late in the pledge time, probably because many people are saying to themselves, "They are not going to make it, so why should I make any special effort?" During some fundraising efforts, I have seen leaders read the amounts and never ask for a subtotal. As a result, the people never know what was given until the pledging is finished. Or I have seen the leaders take the cards into another room or at a table and count them but not read the amounts. At the end, they come back with the news of what was raised. This is like watching a football game and never knowing what the score is until the clock runs out in the fourth quarter. That sure makes it hard to get excited about the game. On the other hand, in meetings where the subtotals were regularly announced, I have seen the Spirit of God come upon a service like a flood that literally swept the whole meeting into a glorious time of giving and praise. The true test of successful fundraising. I have heard men say, "God has shown me there are 10 men in this room who He has asked to give $1,000 each. I plan to stand right down here and wait until every one of you obey God and come down here with the money." This might get the money, but most of us would like to hear from God directly before we part with $1,000. I know I would, and I think I am just about average. If I don't enjoy having someone else hear from God for me, I assume others do not like it either. If God did let me know positively that I was to give an amount that financially was not prudent, and I was sure it was God talking to me, then I can trust God to provide it. I don't believe, however, He would allow my giving amount to hurt me financially. But I would want God to speak directly to me and not through someone else. If the need is so great that the fundraiser has to resort to threats or trickery or fear to maneuver people into giving, then he is trying to do more than God ever expected him to do. In the millions of dollars that God in His goodness has helped me to raise, I have tried to do it with a kind of dignity that would cause God to be happy to receive it. I have tried to do nothing but promote happy, enthusiastic, and spontaneous giving. This is the kind of giver God loves. After all, isn't that our goal? Not simply to raise money, but to please God and to leave His blessing resting on those who have given? That is the true test of successful fundraising. Chapter 8. A Happy Capital Fund Campaign. When a church has a normal growth pattern, there always comes the time when they have to decide whether to enlarge the church facilities or limit their growth to the facilities they have. When this happens, it is always good to call for someone who has had successful experience in church building and fundraising to help them plan just how to proceed. Someone has wisely said, "You can't cross a chasm in 2 short jumps." This is certainly true in a church building program. If you try something that fails, it is very hard to pick up and go from there to success. It is much better to plan before you jump into a program of finance and church building. When I am contacted, I usually ask the pastor 3 questions. What is the church's regular attendance? What is the church's yearly general income? And what part of that general income could be used presently for debt service? The next step is to set up a meeting with the pastor and his leadership, which will consist of his board and the building committee if he has one. There may also be others included whom the pastor considers leaders in the church. In this first meeting, I try to find out what they want to do and whether their goal is financially feasible. If the church has a general income of $500,000 a year, they should be able to allocate $150,000 per year to debt service. Then they can easily borrow $1 million. At 8% on a 15-year loan, the payments would be $120,000 per year. The building plans and the church budget have to be brought together so the project is on safe financial ground. If the new building costs $1,400,000, they should be able to raise somewhere between $250,000 to $500,000 in a capital fund campaign on a one-year pledge plan. If a small church is developing very rapidly and the money is needed immediately, a one-year program has its advantage. This may be true especially if it is a new work. The bank may want some reassurance that it's safe to loan you the money. Raising a substantial amount of money in 1 year usually convinces them of the church's ability to make payments on the loan, even though you have no history to reassure them. If you have a large, well-organized church with a history that shows your ability to fund that large loan, a 3-year commitment will probably be your best approach. In this way, your people can budget their pledge over a 3-year period and make a much larger commitment. This is especially true when the amount needed is several million dollars. Preparing the people to give. If a church asks me to conduct a capital fund campaign, this is the plan I suggest they follow in preparation for the fundraising. 1. The prayer committee. The pastor should choose a group of faithful individuals to head a week of prayer for the whole church, 3 weeks prior to the actual fundraising. Their theme should come from Psalm 127:1. Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. Prayer times during this week can be part of the regular services, or several meetings can be held in homes on evenings when there are no church services. The church should also set aside 1 day for fasting. Everyone should be encouraged to fast for the day or at least 1 meal if possible, but participation should not be compulsory. During this week, prayer should center around raising the money needed, determining the design of the building, selecting the building architects and contractors, and for church growth while the building is under construction. 2. The banquet committee. The church leadership should select several individuals to make preparations for an all-church celebration dinner. The cost of this banquet will be paid by the church. Everyone on the church's mailing list, members and non-members alike, should receive a written invitation to the dinner stating that no pledges will be taken at the dinner. The invitation should note that the purpose of the banquet is to celebrate the progress of the church, which makes it necessary to build. 1 week before the dinner meeting, the banquet committee should set up a telephone brigade to call every person who received an invitation. This will have a positive effect on attendance, usually increasing it 20%. The banquet must be held in a private, quiet place where no band or speaker can be heard on the other side of a thin wall. This is very important. It is also best to take your own public address system. I have spoken in dinner meetings all over the nation, and seldom do I find a PA system in a hotel or restaurant that works properly. If it doesn't function well, or if the hotel personnel have full control of the system, your entire banquet can be ruined. Since the meeting is so important, it pays to set up your own system and get it done beforehand. The restaurant should be advised that the banquet is part of a business meeting. Make it clear that the quicker their personnel can serve the meal and get cleaned up and out of the room, the better it will be for your purposes. The banquet committee should decorate the meeting place with a builder's theme or any other appropriate motif that suggests a feeling of celebration. Arrangements should be made for all children under 12 years of age to be gathered in another building where they can be fed and entertained while the banquet is in progress. This will allow parents to give their full attention to the meeting and not be distracted. 3. The Friday evening banquet. By the time the banquet is held, the architect should have a drawing or elevation of the new building to be shown to those in attendance. The pastor or treasurer should be able to tell the people how they plan to finance the building and that it will be done in a reliable manner. When I speak at these dinner meetings, which are usually held on Friday night, I try to keep the mood very relaxed. It is important to allay any fears the people may have about being subjected to a high-powered fundraiser. I begin by telling them what God does for people who work with Him on any of His projects. To prepare them for the meetings to be held on Saturday and Sunday mornings, I emphasize that these will also be low-key, comfortable gatherings in which no one should feel pressured. I even invite them to bring their friends on Sunday morning. Many times I have had 50 to 100 first-timers attend the Sunday morning when pledges are taken, and they usually enjoy the meeting. And 4, the Saturday morning leadership meeting. This meeting is very important. It can be planned for any time the next day after the Friday evening banquet, preferably Saturday morning. The pastor should invite his church board, the building committee, and any others whom he considers leaders in the church. Usually between 50 to 100 people attend this Saturday meeting. At this time, I introduce the format found in 1 Chronicles 29 concerning the raising of money to build the house of God. This passage records that David first donated money toward the project from Israel's treasury. He then gave from his own personal resources. Next, David challenged the leaders of Israel to give, and their offerings are listed. Then, when the people saw how much David and the leaders had given, the people rejoiced and gave willingly until there was enough. Before the Saturday meeting, I try to get the pastor to agree that he will tell the leaders what he plans to give or allow me to tell them. If the leaders show real faith in making their commitments, the others usually will follow. Then I take blank cards and pass them out to those attending the meeting. After we have prayed, I ask them, if you were to make a commitment right now, how much would you pledge to give over the next year? Then I instruct them to write the amount on the card, but not to sign their name. We will add up these amounts just to see where our faith level is today, I tell them. Then I read each amount as they are added so that people know how much other people are willing to commit. Usually about 1/2 of the total amount pledged in a capital fund campaign is given by the church leadership. If the church is working in the will of God and has made the right decision regarding building or expanding, I believe God will provide the money needed by channeling the funds through His people, if they will pray and listen to His voice. Presenting the opportunity to give. Number 1, the Sunday morning pledge service. I ask the pastor for a full hour to do what I need to do. First, I speak to the congregation about giving and the blessings that come from obeying the Lord. Then I ask the ushers to pass out the pledge cards. Keep it simple: name, address, and the amount they pledge for 1, 2, or 3 years. Next, I pray and then ask the people to write their name and the amount they feel God would have them give over the next year. I ask the ushers to bring up the cards as soon as they have collected, even a few, so that I can start reading the amounts. I do not read any names. As I call out the amounts, someone calculates them. Every few minutes I ask for a subtotal. When the sum is announced, a sense of surprise sweeps across the congregation as they realize how much has been pledged. When the last card has been collected, I praise the Lord with the people for his faithfulness. Then I let them know that pledges will continue to come in for 2 or 3 weeks, but I do not ask them for anything more. We simply rejoice together over what has been done. That is not the end, however. I tell the people I have found in my own giving that the sooner I start paying on a pledge, the easier it is to get it paid. If you can pay any or all of your pledge this morning, it will make it much easier in the long run. Then I call on the ushers again and give the people a chance to pay whatever they can right then and there. Usually $30,000 to $50,000 will be collected during the Sunday morning service. 2. Follow up. During subsequent church services in the weeks following the Capital Fund campaign, I suggest to the pastor that he continue to compliment the people on the money they have already given. He may even want to announce whenever a pledge has been paid in full, without giving the exact amount, of course. In addition, he should keep the congregation informed of the total amount received so far. The people should also be given the opportunity to testify about ways the Lord has helped them pay their pledges and the blessings that have occurred as a result of their giving. This kind of encouragement will bring in far more money than continually urging people to pay their pledge. Happy surprises. Following a Capital Fund campaign, several positive results are usually reported. I do not tell the pastors or congregation to expect these things to happen, but when I check back with the church, I usually find 3 surprises. 1. Giving to the general fund increases dramatically. Why does this happen? Because the more people invest with God, the more they learn that it pays to give. As a result, their total giving picks up. 2. Attendance increases. When people put their hard-earned money toward something, they are more likely to commit themselves to it. In addition, a new building program generates enthusiasm, and progress always creates excitement. And 3, unity among the people in the church increases greatly. I think this is the result of people pulling together to work on a common challenge. Remember, one of the musts in fundraising is to keep it positive and enthusiastic. If you do it scripturally, people will always be happy giving their money away.